So while we're waiting for the speaker to show up, we've had some rearrangements and postponements in particular. So the schedule that you got is not quite accurate. And the first speaker actually is going to be me. And it's a little bit of a trauma talk, a little bit of a sports talk. So I think should be fairly appropriate for this venue. I don't think I've ever given it here. And it does sort of tie into some of the discussions we had yesterday. So I'm sorry about the little stuff at the top, but as you can tell, Zoom and PowerPoint and my computer are sort of fighting with each other a little bit. So humor me a little bit. I didn't have a time to update some of the stuff, so you'll forgive me. I realize it's been a while since I've given this talk. So it's going to be a case presentation, and I think it's kind of cool. And as I looked into it a little bit, I realized that it's not nearly so esoteric as it was. Although we did get this thing published as a case report, thanks to our incredible Department of Pathology. And it's surprisingly broadly applicable, even though you'll think I've lost my mind at first. I think I can show you that it's not nearly so crazy as I had thought. So I'm not conflicted anymore. So I gave this talk at a fancy trauma center, so I wanted to have some objectives. So now you know that I have them. So getting to the case. I was called to the pit, and the story was that we had a restrained operator, high-speed motor vehicle collision versus a tree. Vitals were okay in the field. It took him quite a while to get him out, jaws of life, the whole bit. The car was at a funny angle. The patient was unhelpful, although the door was sufficiently destroyed. That's interest only from a medical standpoint. And he was eating cookies while they were getting him out. They couldn't quite figure that out. Vitals were okay, but he remained quite uncooperative, and they were unable to get a history. In the ED, depressed mental status, as you can see, he's confused, eyes opening to speech, he's localizing, tachycardic and hypertensive. He was a total mesomorph with a lot of striae, and his torso was shaved with prominent veins, but he had cupcake icing all over his face. So Dr. Silent was my boss, and that was a terrifying thing. And as you know, he edited Copes, and Cope used to say, "Diagnose now." So, with the exception of Dr. Kelly, who I think may have seen this before or talked to me about it when we were practicing together, any ideas on what this might be? Moving quickly on. Serum glucose came back at point of care. They did a finger stick of 24. We got labs off, and he responded to an AMP of D50 with immediate resolution of his neurosymptoms, and imaging was obtained. When the patient understood that we had sent labs, he signed out AMA, and before we had been able to collect the urine. So the summary of positive diagnostic results, you see the finger stick and the real glucose. He had some rib fractures and no pneumo, and nothing else on the CT. And there was no urine tox. What was wrong with the guy? Correct. You guys are the best. I want you taking care of me. Insulin doping. Now
well, wait a minute, Jamie. How did you rule out insulinoma? Did you have a C-reactive peptide here? Yes, you do. Yes, you do.
So Dr. Williams is wondering how I knew where the insulin came from. And the answer, of course, is that I don't. But I told you I was friends with a pathologist. And I had asked the resident, at the time to make sure they reserved a sample for additional testing because we needed a C-peptide. The resident was much smarter than I was and told me so in no uncertain terms at 10 o'clock at night and refused. Fortunately, even though I'm dumber, I'm ornery and I'm in the house more than the residents. So I called PATH in the morning and asked them to send off a specimen to the Mayo for the C-peptide. And you can see it was all exogenous since there. Additionally, I told you the guy was really built, and you can see the sex hormones.
Yeah, yeah. Was he a healthcare worker?
No, he was not. One of the beautiful things about doping with insulin is straight insulin is obtainable without a prescription in the United States. You just go into the pharmacy and ask for it. Now, the analogs are not. That regular human insulin is available just for the asking. And so the question is, why would you insulin dope? Remember, this guy was preparing for strength stuff. Well, this is pure pharmaceutical grade, low cost anabolic hormones. Now, obviously, getting prevalence numbers is not easy. There are whole giant bureaucracies devoted to ferreting this out. These are reported incidences and ranges. You see in the elite athletes, it gets up to 40% maybe. But notice that even in local amateur athletes, 10%. High school, 7 or 8% growth hormone. College, amphetamines, 30%. And Dr. Sam Milan isn't here today, but I'm sure he knows more than I do and remembers the Jacques Anquetil comment about mineral water. And, for comparison, ethanol abuse, 30%, diabetes, 10%. So in certain select populations, this is just a huge problem and way more prevalent than you might believe. Now, admittedly, they're not insulin doping. This is sort of all forms of doping. Although the fourth bar is specifically amphetamine use in college students. And the way I was able to make this diagnosis is because I've been taught by Happy Friedman, who has addressed this group in the past. He's a bike fitter in New York and also had an appointment at Hospital for Special Surgery to help out with their rehab. And many of you have been to New York and know there's a big circle road in it, which is just great for riding on bikes. And they have bike races on it. And the New Yorkers have learned that when there's a multi-rider crack up, they send one rig per rider and split them up in the hospital, just like the gangbangers, because roid rage is a thing and they get better things to do, so they just split them up. And when I saw this guy in the emergency room, I heard Happy's voice in my ear talking to me about this. So this is Bayes' theorem, and we don't need to talk about the way it's written down. It's a little bit awkward to read. I got a master's in statistics, and I still find this a little bit difficult. But remember, interpreting your test results is critically dependent on your pre-test conviction of how likely they are to have it, which is usually the prevalence. And thanks to Happy, I knew this was an issue and that people were insulin doping. And, it makes no sense. This guy, was lifting weights so he could be bulked up and I guess, get to meet some babes. Doesn't seem like worth taking that sort of risk. There are all sorts of indications and, there's almost a drug for every need. And Insulin helps you with strength and power and might be able to improve your training intensity and so speed your recovery. It helps with body mass. And this is the thing. Of course, the only problem is insulin has this side effect, which, it's not really a side effect, it makes your glucose go down. And that's why he was eating the cookies. He just got his time and his dose wrong. And, motivation amongst athletes, at the elites, you might be able to argue it's a rational thing to do, but not for guys like my patient. So here's a scenario. You can read it yourself, but essentially there's a magic drug that would make you win every event and kill you 100% for sure in 5 years. And half said they would take it, which we don't think is very adaptive. Remember, insulin is critically involved in protein metabolism. And to Dr. Williams' question, see, I actually have a slide on it. You need the cookies, but it's cheap, it's pure, it's easy to get. There's no parking lot nonsense. It works, it goes away quickly. Everybody knows how to treat it, although even when you can still foul it up. And it's not commonly tested for, because you got to check for the C-peptide. So, doping more generally, blood doping can increase your VO2 max 10-20%, increase your time to exhaustion, relative power output. And the thing is you can dope a little bit and stay below the sensitivity of the tests. And it is quite difficult to catch because they use EPO and combined with autologous doping, and EPO will make it so that your retic count is okay. And you look at these big numbers, and then I put a margin on a time trial because I would argue a time trial is a good place to measure the effect of doping because there's no team effects. And they're absolutely huge. And these differences that you can achieve are greater than the differences between athletes. You have a very, very difficult situation to stop. There are all sorts of risks, like we saw with our guy. People who blood dope drop dead of MIs and DVTs in the middle of the race. I think we all know about anabolic stuff. Thyroid doping, Synthroid is used a lot by people trying to make weight. And growth hormone has the fairly obvious problems that you all know about. So this is not safe. And 7 years ago, in the space of about 15 minutes, I looked up a bunch of athlete obituaries. I couldn't get slides for everybody. But look at that. The guy in the top right was 16 years old and died of an MI. Pantani was all over the papers when he died. So as a result of this desire to have a fair competition, there's a big bureaucracy. There are rules, and there's this thing called an athlete biologic passport where they follow the athlete over time to try to develop specific thresholds for that athlete to see if they've been doping. There's random screening, but the dirty little secret about random screening is 90% of it is for cause, and there's a lot of education. I do some work with athletes, and I have to take classes every year, and they have to take classes every year. Elite athletes have to check in every night and say where they are going to be for the next 3 days so they can be tested. But it turns out there are places in South America where they're too far from the reference lab, so that's a great place to train. Plus you get altitude. And regarding athlete biologic passport, it's a really good idea, but since the athletes know how it works, you can fool around with your doping regimen out of competition to make your confidence intervals get broader. Skiers, Bodie Miller is a very famous downhiller, arguably the most famous American skier of the last 30 years. And you can You can read what he said. I'm not going to read the whole thing to you, but his argument was essentially it's going to happen anyway, and it's the athlete's job to make the trade-offs. Needless to say, this didn't go over well, but Bodie's famous for not really caring what people thought about what he said. So that was one approach which fell flat. And the thing is you saw those prevalence figures. Everybody knows that there are problems in cycling. There's problems in weightlifting. There's problems in football. There's blood doping in sprinting. And it's like, it's a pure anaerobic activity. Why would anybody do that? It's like, so they can train harder and recover faster. It has nothing to do with the race directly. So there are a lot of people out there. That 10% figure on the Weekend Warriors I gave, there's a emergency room physician at Brown named Mark Grieve who maintains a doping database, and you have to opt in and report yourself. So 10% of the accountants out there are willing to dope and actually do, so they can beat the lawyer to the stop sign on their weekly ride. There's way more out of it than you realize. So I'm hoping I met my objectives. And if I go through the slide fast enough, you won't be able to tell. And I'd be happy to take any questions. Now I got to go back to being the audio visual guy.
So Jamie, what do you say to the person that says that it is even competition because everyone's dope?
This is a difficult problem because, it's true. That Jacques Anquetil quote about the Tour de France is totally true. And from what I understood, about 10 years ago, literally everybody on the peloton was doping. And so I'm sorry, I'm trying to do a couple of things at once here. There we go. I am no longer screen sharing, which means I can be PowerPoint boy again, I think. No, stop share. There we go. Stop share.
So is this fundamentally a need for there to be some type of integrity of sports ethics integral to the education of our athletes? Where do we begin in reconfiguring a competitive environment that we all can view as rational?
I think you have to start at the junior level with that. I do think there's a role for testing and making an example out of people. Testing is tricky though, because not only you have to test, and like I said, 90% of the random tests are not actually random at all, they're for cause. So they sort of know, but to prosecute someone, there's this thing called due process. And to make due process work, you have to show them your data and tell them your processes. So every time you do that, you're telling them how to beat it the next time.
That's correct.
And I was asked to go to Indianapolis, Indiana, the home of the National Collegiate Athletic Association, for a doping conference sponsored by WADA. And they had so these were all these bigwigs. And the Swedes sent a bunch of tall blonde girls, and the Caribbean nations had all these sprinters. And the British had a couple of guys from Oxford. And the guys from Kazakhstan didn't really say a whole lot. Took a whole lot of notes. Our good friends from China, pretty much the same thing. And, so I think the only way, essentially, you got to want to play fair. And given the rewards available in sports, and particularly how big those rewards are relative to the alternatives for a lot of these people. And bike racing is classically a sport of poor people. Football, Pele grew up barefoot.
Yeah.
Yeah, you got to get to mom and dad, I think.
I think arguments made for the,
Go ahead on it.
I just wanted to touch on one point that Mallory already made, is that arguments that touch on the integrity of sports or some kind of ethical dimension to fair play, I don't think are enforceable, particularly when the rewards are so great and sports still represents the opportunity for somebody who has nothing but talent to be able to turn that talent into profit. But I do have some concern about the health of the players. Using the performance enhancing drugs, whatever they may be, leads to people that are bigger, stronger, faster, carry much more momentum, and we see much more injury, even in non-contact sports where doping is prevalent. And I think for the health of the athlete, I think that's the more pressing mandate to keep performance enhancing substances out.
Or the punishment severe enough?
Well,
Punishment severe
right.
enough, Jamie. Let's use the sports you know about, cycling and skiing.
So I work a lot with alpine skiers, and the beautiful thing about alpine skiing is doping doesn't help a whole lot. However, there's this thing called Nordic skiing where blood doping helps a whole awful lot. One of the most egregious examples was at the World Championships, the Austrians left behind in their condo all their transfusion supplies, empty blood bags and transfusion needles and the whole bit. There have been raids in the Tour de France like that. I think when you look at the efficacy of the penalties, you have to look at the size of them. You have to look at the relative frequency of getting caught relative to the incidence of the action, and probably the lag time. So all of a sudden I'm describing a Skinner box, and no, I don't think we're there. And it is very difficult. Feel free to try to ask a question. I'm doing the sound and I'm talking, and as you can see, it's pretty difficult for me to do things at once, but if you do have questions, I'd like to hear them.
I'm about to speak now. I want to know about probably one of the more famous, well, let me stay within the biking skiing. I was going to ask about Ben Johnson, but that's a little bit too far back. Let's go with 7-time yellow jersey winner, and give me your commentary on the psychology and the risk reward and the want to win because of the reward, but the psychology of what was not an individual but a collaborative cartel of doping. When we talk about this stuff, we can hang Lance up on a cross, but there was a cartel around him that signed off on and had a consensual environment around this. And I want kind of you, as a person who's closer to these environments, to talk about how that group think dynamic. We've had a talk on teams. We've had a talk on group cognitive model. It works both ways. Everybody wants to do their own thing. The group cognitive model kind of works like that. So tell me what your feel for disruptive thinking is on a team.
Oh boy, yeah, that's a real big one. So full disclosure is I don't have too much to disclose, although the Postal Service team about which Mallory is asking questions was sponsored by Thomas Weisel Partners. And as far as I'm aware, he's a straight up guy, and he is heavily involved in the United States Ski Association, and one of his kids races in Europe. I don't have any material non-public information. So Lance had a lot of psychological quirks, and even if you read his autobiography, he hints at them. The people he raced against have spoken and eventually came out. One of the things I found so fascinating about the Postal Service team at the time was, of the 7 athletes competing in the tour, 2 of them were good Mennonite boys, Floyd Landis and Levi Leipheimer. I grew up in Worcester, Ohio, and Wayne County, and that doesn't mean a whole lot, but the next county south is Holmes County. And oh, were there Amish folks down there. And they kind of like bicycles. Doping doesn't fly. So even people with a strong background of upright people can get caught up in it. And the athletes were all in it. Everybody knew the athletes were doping too. There were stories about the team car coming up and giving them a jab while they're on the road. You say you can test for EPO, which is true, but if you give it intravenously in the evening, it's gone by morning, and they can't test you between 10 p.m. and 7 a.m. And people know that. And the desire to win, going back to that Lombardi quote, and I'm not saying Vince Lombardi is a crook, far from it, but you take that sort of thinking to its logical conclusion, you get to some very dark places. Public knowledge, one could come to the conclusion, Lance, who lives here, by the way, was a vindictive guy. He had a big contract to produce bikes, and they're good bikes. And they went after LeMond, and it's hard to buy a Greg LeMond bike now. And LeMond had spoken out against what was by then a fairly open secret. If you guys this afternoon go rewatch the Ride Up Oticam, it's thrilling. The hair on the back of my neck still goes up, but it's thrilling partly because it's completely impossible. He made up 12 minutes in half an hour on the second best guy in the world. There's just no way. So, and one last bit, and I'm running on, but we got a little bit of time because I rolled through my slides. When I was at that conference in Indianapolis, one of the guys from WADA came out, and a German cyclist had turned state's evidence, and they showed his regimen. And the top cell of the spreadsheet was the guy's name, so cell A1. The rest of column A was dates. Then there are about 8 columns of interventions. Donating blood, transfusing blood, getting EPO to mask the problems with the reticulocyte count, getting albumin to help ensure that his hematocrit didn't get too high and sludge, Synthroid to make weight, because in cycling, again, it's power to weight ratios, everything. So all other things being equal, being skinny is really, really helpful. Growth hormone, again, on the protein. So, multiple endocrine interventions, multiple blood interventions. And I was watching this, and at the time I was working with Dr. Williams at Boston. I worked in what we told the public was a very fancy intensive care unit. After all, Dr. Moore invented it. It had to be the best. And I realized that I would have had a very difficult time administering this regimen with Brigham critical care nurses looking after the athlete. And that's when it finally dawned on me, the scale. It took me a while to get there, but yeah. Other questions? So the good thing is if you're racing the accountant to the stop sign, you're probably not going to get subject to random dosing. But if you get beat, it's okay to ask some pointed questions of your fellow competitor. But seriously, I mean, this is not just a problem at the Olympics. And it's frightening. A lot of people think they have the intelligence and the training to do it. And at the elite levels, they do have these spooky doctors. But the amateurs are sort of winging it. So Forewarned is forearmed. Now, our next talk is, first of all, I gave my talk in lieu of Dr. Camp from Michigan, who's plans to talk about care of the thoracic organ duct. Now, do you remember all the way back to yesterday, and John Marinara said you don't need a chest surgeon to cannulate and do ECMO? Well, it turns out in Grand Rapids you do. So Dr. Camp's putting someone on ECMO right now. Anybody who's gotten a copy of the most recent schedule, it says that I'm about to talk about lower extremity compartment syndrome, but if I could prevail upon Dr. Williams to give his talk about the Howard University response to the polypandemic, he will go then. And oh, sorry about that. I still haven't turned sharing on. Bear with me. Sharing. Where is it? Bear with me. I'm a little overwhelmed by the magnitude and number of my tasks. Can't walk and chew gum at the same time. This is the wrong sharing thing, but I will find the right sharing thing here. And now you should be able to share. Yes, sir. All right. So Dr. Williams is going to be giving us a number of talks this meeting, more than he had originally planned to, thanks to the opportunities offered us by schedule instability. Thanks, Mallory.
Anytime, I want to thank Jamie Watkins for all he does to make this organization great and to make this meeting work as it is now currently in a hybrid format. I think God is up to something, Rocky Mountain Traumatological Society, because Jamie asked me if I could give an extra talk yesterday, and I said yes. And as I was looking at the talk that I was going to give, the additional one, it dawned on me that this is a talk that I probably should have given anyway. I want to talk to you about the Howard University Hospital's trauma response to a polypandemic, and I'll explain to you exactly what that is. We've heard about COVID-19 in the morning presentations, and I'll go into that concept a little deeper without the management and pathophysiology. I have no disclosures. I've been working all my career to get some, and I still have not achieved that. Forgive me or pray for me, one. I think in Act 2 of the Broadway play Hamilton, we see Hamilton and Eliza grieving at the loss of their son, Philip. And they have lost Philip to that most American disease called gun violence. And if we think heavily about that disease, we know that Hamilton himself would be lost to that same disease. When we really think about their response to it in the Broadway play, whether you have been actually to New York or you've seen off-Broadway productions or you've seen or heard the soundtrack, they call this loss of Philip the unimaginable. So what shall we then call the loss of upward now headed toward 1 million lives in America to COVID-19 and over, of course, 10 million cases here. And that is where indeed the title comes from, facing the unimaginable. When you look at this pandemic, particularly in the perspective of disadvantage, I'm talking about Appalachia, I'm talking about urban minority communities now, we see that there are multiple pandemics that are rolled into the health pandemic. So it is multiple health pandemics, physical health, which deals with the viral related illnesses that we've heard about, but also we see intimate partner violence and penetrating trauma wrapped into the physical health aspects of this pandemic, along with mental health. Most distressing in our kids, we see anxiety levels and depression. We see that there are community health concerns that deal with quarantine. But we also see social economic pandemics that go right along with COVID-19, that of unemployment, business closure, and probably the most disturbing, and the one that will stay with us the longest here in America, that is that of educational delay and the travesty of the failure of distance learning in minority and disadvantaged communities. And so we now refer to COVID-19 not just simply as a health pandemic, but in fact as a polypandemic. I want to say that at Howard University Hospital Level 1 Trauma Center, we fundamentally view ourselves as an institution that is a little bit different than what the American College of Surgeons would call a trauma center. In other words, we view ourselves as actively putting ourselves out of work every day. We are actively building the communities that we serve in order to prevent injuries so that we are not needed as a Level 1 trauma center. And when you think about that concept, it rests firmly in what I call the telos of a university. And let us now review what President Daniel Court Gilman, you may recognize that name, one of the presidents of Johns Hopkins, said in his commemoration day in 1885, the benefits which society derives from university. President Gilman says it is a reaching out for a better state of society that now exists. It means a wish for less misery among the poor, less ignorance in schools, less bigotry in the temple, less suffering in the hospital, less fraud in business, less folly in politics. Yes, he said this indeed in 1885. I will let you decide whether that speech is still relevant as we sit here today in 2022. I believe it is, but this is the telos of university that President Gilman was talking about, that we then derive our purpose from at Howard University Hospital Level 1 Trauma Center. The former president said one thing correctly. The violence that we see in Americans' urban centers is in fact American carnage. Make no mistake about that. And the question is, what kind of adequate policy, adequate community engagement, adequate violent prevention strategies do you bring to bear to subdue this carnage? We've heard from Jamie's shock trauma colleague in LA, Shaka has brought us wonderful ideas about how hospital-based violence intervention programs can begin to get at this. I want to share with you some of the things that we do at Howard University Hospital. Been fortunate enough to write position papers on this pre-pandemic, really talking about the need for a better coordinated national research agenda, money going toward gun research, et cetera. It's kind of an interesting position to have as a Second Amendment person, but that is the position that I have. I've written it from the position of the Society of Black Academic Surgeons. I've also written it from the nation's largest organization of minority physicians, the National Medical Association. Both position papers, I was very happy to be an author on. When the pandemic came, those of us in the DC, Washington, Maryland region got together and decided that we were really going to take a look at what was going on with our trauma numbers. And so shock trauma, Hopkins, Howard, GW, Hospital Center, Northern Virginia, and Nova Fairfax, we all got together and put our trauma registries together and produced this manuscript, which is published in Trauma and Critical Care Open Access. And it basically shows that if we look at the pre-COVID era, that penetrating trauma went up during the first alpha wave. Gunshot wounds went up to 11.8%. Stab wounds went up from 7 to about 9%. And blunt trauma went down. And of course, you know, that makes a whole lot of sense because what? We were not traveling as much on the roads, so there were less opportunities for car accidents. And yet that misery index inside of some of our urban corridors were enhanced through supply chain issues and also through quarantine policy. And so we saw very early on that even as we were trying to control this disease in the alpha wave, that trauma and acute care surgeons were uniquely positioned to be exposed to this disease amongst unvaccinated trauma victims, which were increasing in the DC, Maryland, and Virginia region. I won't tell you how many of our great surgical journals decided to not to decline publishing this paper, but it did find a home, as all papers tend to do. And I think the data is terribly interesting and of historical importance. But there was something additional that I was seeing during the alpha wave, and that was I was seeing more women come in with violent injuries that clearly were not from gunshot wounds, stab wounds, or car accidents. And I saw them, particularly those with children, leave the hospital AMA or against medical advice. I saw a hovering of them by their significant others, and that crossed sexual orientation and lines as well. And so we clearly saw that intimate partner violence was spiking as well in our trauma registries. At Howard University Hospital, we have a special filter for intimate partner violence. We also have a special filter for violence against the LGBT community, because these are particular issues that we were struggling with pre-pandemic. And so we are one of the unique trauma registries that actually filters for those mechanisms. We had done a paper in conjunction with the folks at Center for Surgery and Public Health that really showed that when we looked at firearm assaults across a time spectrum, we saw that they were actually increasing by 2.5 times from 2001 to 2017. And it was quite interesting that we saw those spikes and increases more in young women. And so we saw not only intimate partner violence increasing, but we had previous data that was published in not such a bad journal, Annals of Surgery, that showed us that there was also a 2.5 times increase in assaults against women. And these were assaults with firearms. And we know that most of the time when women die from intimate partner violence, it is from a firearm. So what is the advocacy and the community engagement that we have offered going forward to address these issues, many of which, by the way, were issues pre-pandemic and just intensified during what we call a polypandemic? Well, the first thing was, how do we begin to have difficult conversations inside of communities that have not had these conversations before? And so we had to use technology and webinars to begin to discuss this whole issue of intimate partner violence, the whole issue of what was available from the cellular apps for women to have and safe haven place. Remember, during the alpha wave, our hospitals were basically being shut down to accessory personnel. So social workers and people from outside who would be assistive in their services were not allowed in these hospitals. And that really put a drain on us being able to do direct referrals to safe haven locations. We had these conversations. They were difficult. We also wrote about the issues. And I think having the open conversation and writing about them was important. The intimate partner violence text, which is edited by Ron Bailey, a psychiatrist and former president of the National Medical Association, was interesting because it was scheduled to be published right in the beginning of the alpha wave. And I said, listen, Ron, a good friend, we got to wait because there's something interesting that I'm seeing happen in the data, and it's got to go into this textbook. And he was gracious and allowed for the publication date to be pushed back. And for that, I'm very grateful. There were other difficult conversations that had to be had. And if you thought talking about intimate partner violence was hard, try talking about building relationships or sustainable relationships between police and communities of color. We all have had our televisions on over the last 2 to 4 months. We've all understand and know the name Mr. Floyd, and yet we needed to begin to have a discussion that addressed the core problem, which was we have a bad relationship with those people who are entrusted to care for our law enforcement needs. And it was only through a conversation that we were going to begin to put together the pieces to begin to understand how to build a better relationship. And we did this at the National Medical Association's national meeting in 2020. And I'm very proud of that. Howard University would be, the Level 1 Trauma Center would be a foundational institution for that conversation. So we do have a hospital-based violence intervention program. We call our hospital-based violence-based intervention program Triumph. I am the PI of that, and we do provide all kinds of assistance for victims of violence. That's employment, housing, counseling. That is recreational assistance where we have stress reduction with boxing. And that program was actually featured in the Atlantic's documentary, Doctors and Guns. And this is Amy Rosenberg, the chair at Temple, you see on the cover of that documentary YouTube page. And I'm in that documentary as well, talking about how we began to utilize hospital resources to get at reductions in violence in our community. We don't just do the program, but we actually test for the efficacy. It's a funded program over 2 years. And we've been renewed for this program over 5 times, and we're very happy about that. And we publish the results of the program that we've been seeing at Howard University. When we looked at the gunshot wound injuries in our children, Dr. Zinedine, I think is on the webinar right now. This is work that he led in authoring. We found that disfiguring injuries in our children who suffer from gunshot wounds were significant. So when we looked from 2007 to 2015, here's the frequency of disfigurement that we found taking place in our children. Just amputations, craniectomies, enucleations of the eye, ileostomy, colostomies being the most one of the most prominent, and then tracheostomy, leaving, of course, the scar on the neck. All of this disfigurement, just as we would consider it a psychological impediment if these children had been burned, they are also psychological impediments for them as they represent scars. From this work that we published in American Surgeon, the idea came about of how do we really begin to talk to our children and community about being more accepting of other individuals. How do they be good friends? And then how do they cope with the scars that they have and don't really have good foundations to be able to explain them? A young medical student from Howard University who seeks to be a plastic surgeon, Joseph Talbert, got together as a creative illustrator with me, and we wrote a book, The Scars That Scar, teaching our children about how to be good friends, how to create supportive communities for kids that are different, and then how to deal with their own either physical or emotional scars. We perform a peer consulting program, Engage, Empowering the Next Generation to Achieve Greatness, which now has over 200 students. We partner with U.S. District Attorney's Office, DC Police Department, Maryland Public Schools, DC Public Schools, Virginia, and local churches. And we really have in detail conversations with our children, both about their futures and careers, but also about how do we perform and execute that thing called conflict resolution. It is time, and I will say this, and if you don't hear anything else, it is time for us to get to the place where we understand deconfliction needs to be taught, not in the home alone, but in our public school curriculums, because the road to violence is not understand how to deal with and understand difference. Okay, and so if we don't teach that, we shouldn't expect our kids to have it, and then we should expect them to do what they see on TV. We've also adopted a high school, a trauma center that is adopted a high school. Think about that. And we have a class, and we see these. This is some of my most important work when I'm not in the operating room being dictatorial to my teams. And we believe fundamentally that every child is inspired, should be inspired and prepared for education. And we make sure that all of our class has school supplies every year. We talk to them about conflict resolution. We give them speakers and career advisement, tutorial advisement. So what we're doing is reaching into the community at the high school level, seeking to get to children before other influences get to them and they begin to make decisions that are quite inappropriate. what we do on a local level, we have reproduced on the national level. So I'm so proud to say that I direct the American College of Surgeons High School program. So everywhere the college goes, when we're in person, we have high schools come in and participate in the exhibit halls, that beautiful exhibit hall that the college puts on, to begin to understand that they can do things with their careers. When you look at this picture and you see junior high school and high school kids interacting with Andre Campbell up in the upper left-hand corner, or interacting with laparoscopic machines, little children that are on Da Vinci robots that cost $2.5 million, you have then exposure that these kids are receiving that certainly gives them a foundation to dream bigger and higher and longer. We've also engaged our community, particularly the women within our community who tend to be leaders and healthcare decision makers, through webinars. I'm very proud of that, and have done basically 2-3 series webinars talking about health in the community in a way that people can understand. And part of this is getting at vaccine hesitancy, which is a real issue in the African-American and minority communities. And guess what? It is a real issue in every other community as well. The only thing that my most conservative brothers and sisters in this country agree with the African-American community on, in almost 100% agreement, is the fact that they don't like the vaccine. It's a remarkable thing. And so the question is, how do we begin to change that picture as it relates to decompacting our hospitals at critical times? In Washington, D.C., there's a huge digital inequity divide. 25% of D.C. homes have no broadband. And here you have the racial distribution of individuals who are impacted by that. And so what did we do at Howard University Hospital? We set about to use microphilanthropy as a tool to support community-based community laboratories so that kids could have a place to go to do the distance learning that they were all of a sudden being asked to do for their health and for their safety. But not just computer labs, we do microphilanthropy across the board. So whether it's here, you see the founder of a gentleman who teaches kids the physics of bikes. They actually build bicycles in urban environments and then teach them what are the physics behind riding a bike, and then how do we ride a bike safely. We pay for the helmets, we pay for the bike kits, and we got to have Dr. Watkins come out and talk about this anti-doping stuff so we get these bicycle riders heading in the right direction at a young age. But yes, we support many different community organizations, anything that gives children a better option than the usual options that they have. Always helps when the guy with the big plane and the big black limo in the White House on 1600 Avenue can show up. He's here with my president, President Wayne A.I. Frederick, visiting Howard Simulation Lab, and has also come a couple other times to deal with bigger, broader discussions in higher education. On the right, you see me at GW's Health Summit. You'll recognize I'm on the stage with Lena Wynn, someone you obviously see frequently on TV talking about the COVID-19 pandemic, and Megan, another person from the Affirm group, who's an ED doctor in the Northeast. You see, we're discussing here common sense healthcare, common sense firearm reform in the nation. It always helps when you got a beautiful, articulate leader who can help you with the vaccine hesitancy issue. Our president is that and has held many different forums, as I have, dealing with the community and talking about the efficacies of the vaccine, particularly the 2 mRNA vaccines, Moderna and Pfizer, and also the AdVac vaccine by J&J. Also continuing that education into the booster after now 5 months after the second or third dose of the primary dose of the vaccine, and then other adjuvant therapies, be they monoclonal antibodies, which are not as effective against the Omicron variant, or the new protease inhibitor therapies from Merck and from Pfizer. I am a member of Affirm's research group, and we did partner with Affirm, which is now owned by the Aspen Institute, is a part of the Aspen Institute, and for the Reframe DC project with regards to gun violence. They did this in Chicago as well. And so very proud that we could partner with a prominent organization like the firm to really begin to get at gun violence in the urban environments and urban centers. We don't just stay on the national side. We try to seek out and have an international footprint. And so we have done trauma consultations with the nation of Trinidad and Tobago. Our president at Howard University is a native of Port of Spain in Trinidad. So we've had the great pleasure of meeting with their Minister of Health and their team in how to really develop and cultivate a coherent trauma system. We've also done that in the Bahamas, and very pleased to do that work on behalf of the greater West Indies. When Abaco hit the Bahamas, many of us remember the devastation, the hurricane. We remember that devastation. And I called my former junior resident, Wesley Francis, who's the chief of surgery at Princess Margaret Hospital in Nassau. I said, "What do you need the most?" He said, we really need X-fixes. So I knew this organization would know, even though I couldn't tell you what these sets that I'm showing you here, or I knew this organization would certainly be able to appreciate what these sets represented for this nation. And we shipped those down, and we're very proud to be able to make that contribution along with the intellectual contributions we make through lectures and all kinds of partnerships. As I wind up here, we've kept doing trauma education. We knew that trauma was spiking in urban environments and that people's knowledge of being able to take care of that trauma through ATLS was going to be important. So we continued to do trauma education after people had long since stopped because of the pandemic. In the vaccination era, we required 100% student vaccination for those courses, but we continue to do the trauma education in spite of the pandemic. And I just believe that that's the right thing to do. Not only that, during the alpha wave of this variant, when the UK strain was prevalent, I was mobilized to Southern Command in Honduras and became a chief advisor to the general at Southern Command, commanding officer of Southern Command, and also the educational, sponsor the education through Howard University's Trauma Center for the education of the medical providers at Sotocano, which is the major medical facility in Honduras there, and was very proud to be able to do that as a Howard University faculty member and colonel in the United States Army. All of this work will eventually get noticed, and the government of the District of Columbia made Howard a Center of Excellence for Trauma and Violence Prevention, gave us $2.5 million, which is not a lot over 5 years, but it was more than what we had. And so I'm very grateful for them for that. Let it be said, one of my favorite quotes about mountains is by Hesiod. In front of excellence, the immortal gods have put sweat, and long and steep is the way to it, and hard at first. But when you come to the top, then it is easy, even though it is hard. Thank you, Rocky Mountain Traumatological Society, and I stand ready to take any of your questions.
Excellent. That was a wonderful, spectacular.
Fortunately, I got to go in front of Dr. Williams.
Oh.
Do we have any questions?
Yeah.
And while you guys are queuing up, I'll ask one, which is, Mallory, this is a remarkable response by the institution, and the problems the district faces are fairly well known. How do you know it works, and when?
How do I know it works where?
And when will you know? Is this,
Right.
will this take a year, a decade, generations?
Yeah, the district where they gave the big chunk of change or the little chunk of change, depending on what your perspective is, some kind of efficacy data, right? And I said to them, with this little bit of money, do you really want me to spend somewhere around 20% of it doing efficacy work, or can we all agree that giving people a job is probably good, and giving people options in communities besides the ones that they have is probably good? Can we, are there some questions we can forego here? These things are impactful. And the government answer was, to the best of your ability, will work. And so I think when we look at the paper that we've done on recidivism for the hospital-based intervention program we're talking about interventions that have to take place over decades to begin to get at the disinvestment that are in some of these communities. What I often will say to on the policy testimony is that we know in this country the great divide in how we invest in American children and whether or not they work. In other words, if you are a student in the city of Chicago and I compare you to the northern suburbs, Highland Park, where Michael Jordan used to live, or Forest Park, one suburb to the north, the differential in the investment of those two children exceeds $20,000 per annum. We don't question whether that's effective. We allow that that disparity in funding to continue to exist. And then when we finally use in the urban environment, we ask, well, is this really working? It's a peculiar request. It really fails on its head for me. But I do think if you're talking about larger amounts of investment, we certainly do have efficacy programs that are built into it. So that quite the long answer to I don't know.
Well, that is the politest way I've been told that I asked a really dumb question. Let's see if we can get some better ones.
Can I ask a question?
Absolutely.
Okay, that's spectacular talk, Melanie.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned Appalachia, because when I did this program, violence intervention program, at the University of Maryland in the early 1990s, I looked at the homicide rates in rural America, and I found it to be the same as it was in the urban areas. And so it's a problem all over. And I'm sure Ed is familiar with it with his work in rural areas. And we need facilities like what you have in the rural areas. It's a need for both. I'm interested in what exactly happens to somebody who gets shot and survives, has to be hospitalized and survives in your program. What actually happens to them?
That's a great question. So I think the major thing that happens is that during the morning report, as it's called in some trauma centers, we call it pass-on rounds at Howard, where we're turning over the patient care from the evening to the next shift. We acknowledge a fundamental thing. This is not normal. If you do turnover of care for 10 years in an urban level 1 trauma center, you will fall mentally into some bad habits. And that is believing that someone who has been stabbed or shot is a normal event. That is not normal. That is abnormal behavior in a democracy. It should be treated as such. And then once we address the abnormal, it's more easier to deal with, okay, we're not just gonna deal with the symptoms of the problem, we're gonna start getting at the real issues. And so these people are referred in the hospital to our violence interventional specialists, which are part of that hospital-based violence program. Those individuals are what is known as credible messengers. And they begin to understand what the home environment is, just like you did at Shock Trauma years ago, long before Cornell Cooper published the paper. Understanding who works in the household, what is the educational attainment level of that household, what are the challenges facing that household per unit day, per unit time. And then from there, there can be a bombardment of services, both hospital-based and city-based, around those individuals. The chief amongst those services, of course, are housing security where that does not exist. And just as important as housing security, in my opinion, is employment security. Finding a skill and beginning to join tax-paying citizens in this country. Because where there is work, there is dignity, and there are a whole lot of other, I think, salutary effects that come from having a job, keeping a job, and being responsible. And so I'm a big believer in employment. And so I think that's a job is probably one of the number one violent measures we can give a person coming out the program. And we have managed to place somewhere around 22% of the people who have come into our trauma center with violent injury.
What is the biggest impediment? I think that's spectacular, actually, and I think that would work. What has been the difficulty getting them jobs? Is it difficulty in getting them ready? Because that's the big hurdle. You being job ready is a big deal. Or is it that there are no jobs? And if there are no jobs, what can be done to fix that?
So pre-pandemic, there were some issues with job numbers. Pandemic, 4.9 million people in America just quit their job last quarter. There are plenty of jobs in this economy. We can argue whether or not those jobs are high paying, but we cannot argue that the economy right now is poised to take on more workers. The number one problem that I have is job preparedness. Just like you have to have kids who are prepared to go to school, you have to have individuals who are prepared to go to a job, and the discipline and the stick-to-itiveness and all the other skills which we can provide for them. There are programs that do a great job in that. And then stabilizing the home situation, which means you got to know the challenges. Sometimes if the home situation is so unstable that they're going to be missing work every 3 days, then don't waste your time putting a job out there because they're not in a position to hold the job. You've got to stabilize the home first, right? And that becomes an issue of social work and social services and the multidisciplinary approach that we take along with the city to do that.
Excellent. One final thing, could the city provide some jobs or make some jobs that, things that have to be done, but could the city do a better job in making some jobs?
Well, I think there are city jobs that are available. The question of skill set, matching skill sets. In general, I deal a lot with the private sector in that issue. I think the private sector does a great job doing that because most jobs that are going to be available are going to be with small businesses, in fact. And the other thing I think that the city does a good job in is investing in entrepreneurial work amongst this population. And one of the things that has surprised me, Tuffy, is the amount of individuals who actually are entrepreneurial who are victims of violent injury. And so we have people who are already landscaping. We have people who are already washing windows. We have people already with skill sets that know how to do masonry in some sense. And then we have people also who already have backgrounds in construction, which happens to be booming right now in our nation's capital.
Excellent. That's great. I wish we could make this much bigger. This
is a really important set of questions, and I would like to continue.
Yeah.
But now, and those of you who are looking closely at the schedule realize there's a lot of sorting going on. We had a number of last-minute cancellations. But Dr. Cherry Abraham from OHSU will be addressing us as soon as I let him.
He stopped sharing for you.
On blunt aortic injury, which is a topic about which we don't know enough and we see too often. And to that end, I will be quiet and give him the ability to teach us. Thank you very much for joining us. We're delighted to have such a strong contingent from OHSU. And with luck, this will be an ongoing thing.
Well, thanks very much, Jimmy. Can you hear me?
We hear you.
Yes.
Okay, and can you see, I don't know can you see the slideshow version of the PowerPoint, or do you see the slide sorter?
We see this show, just the slide.
Okay, perfect. So I think my name's Cherry Abraham. I'm the director of the Aortic Center here in Portland, Oregon at the Oregon Health and Science University. And really privileged to be able to give you this talk. I wish I was there in person. My 14-year-old snowboarder son has been crying himself to sleep every night since I told him that we couldn't come to Snowmass because things have gotten a little bit in a crisis here. We have 2 vascular surgeons who are down with COVID, and that leaves 3 of us, and I couldn't take the risk of getting stuck in Snowmass, even though it's a great place to get stuck. So I'm going to be talking about blunt thoracic aortic injury. I think most of us know the universal mechanism of injury is rapid deceleration. Blunt thoracic aortic injury is defined as a tear in the aorta, usually a result of a combination of shear and stretch forces, rapid deceleration, increased intravascular pressure, and compression of the aorta between the anterior chest wall and the vertebrae. And there's 3 theories about the mechanism of injury, but I suspect all of these have a part to play. The first theory being that the aortic isthmus is really a transition zone from the unfixed aortic arch to the very fixed descending thoracic aorta. And then when you have that mechanism of injury, you basically have a shear injury, or each area is going in opposite directions during the rapid deceleration, and that leads to the tear in the intima, or sometimes even more severe, a rupture. The second theory being the weaker tensile strength existing in the tissue at the level of the aortic isthmus makes it intrinsically more vulnerable to injury. And the third theory being that there being a compression point between the sternum and the spinous processes in the thoracic vertebrae causes a pinching of the aorta during the deceleration. And as I mentioned, I think it really is a combination of all 3. It's not necessarily one in isolation. Estimate that 8,000 to 9,000 blunt trauma victims suffer fatal aortic injuries every year in the United States. It's the 2nd most common cause of death in trauma patients, behind an intracranial hemorrhage. High mortality, 50% will die within 24 hours without being addressed. And as I mentioned, the location of injury in 50 to 70% of cases is distal to the subclavian in the area of the ligamentum arteriosum, which we all know is the embryological remnant of the ductus arteriosus. Usually the motor vehicle accident usually is a head-on in 81% of cases. The rest is usually either motor vehicle accidents from another direction, or also less commonly fall from heights, crush injuries, a pedestrian involved in a motor vehicle accident. Those usually make up the remainder 20%. 1.5% of all thoracic trauma is represented by blunt thoracic aortic injury. And as I mentioned, the in-hospital mortality is as high as just under 50%. And it's rarely an isolated injury. It's only an isolated injury in less than 20% of cases. With the advent of fast access to CT scans, we're seeing less education for our medical students regarding chest X-ray. I think most of us remember this was drilled into us, all the signs that you would be looking on a chest X-ray. Wide mediastinum, at supine greater than 8 centimeters, upright greater than 6 centimeters, the enlarged aortic knob, the left apical cap, hemothorax, the deviation of the NG tube to the right, deviation of the trachea to the right, and the main stem bronchus downwards, and of course the wide left paravertebral stripe. But now that we have rapid access to the CT, this is the main diagnostic imaging of choice. And what are we looking for in the aorta? We're looking for intimal flaps, periaortic or mediastinal hematomas, luminal filling defects, in some cases pseudoaneurysms, and in severe cases contained rupture or vessel wall disruption, and usually it's evidenced by active extravasation of IV contrast. So in this figure that I pulled from the literature, you can see some of the features. You see a mediastinal hematoma in panel A. You see evidence of radiographic evidence of the intimal intimal tear and pseudoaneurysm in the thoracic aorta, and then of course evidence of the hemothorax. On this aortogram, either in the left anterior or the right anterior oblique, you can see circumferential tear of the proximal descending thoracic aorta. We usually only see this once we get to the operating room or the hybrid operating room. This is another example of a focal tear that you see in the proximal thoracic aorta associated with a large amount of hemothorax. And then you can see a detailed look at the pseudoaneurysm that you're seeing here. You can see my cursor pointing to that and the broken arrow as well. Sometimes the CT findings are pretty subtle. Of course, you're not going to have access to the aortogram on the right, but on the CT scan, depending on the amount of artifacts, it's not difficult to miss these injuries. And sometimes you won't appreciate that there is a little bit of intramural hematoma as opposed to artifact, and that you have to be very careful that you don't miss these injuries. And for that reason, we almost insist on, if there's any question, repeating a CT after 24 to 48 hours if the radiologists don't make a specific call on it. This is the classification that we use. Took this from the Society of Vascular Surgery. We grade according to 4 classifications, grade 1 being the intimal tear, grade 2 associated intramural hematoma, grade 3 is a pseudoaneurysm, and grade 4 is a frank rupture. So again, open repair is starting to become a historical operation. We do less and less. The location of the injury dictates the approach. It's usually a high postural lateral thoracotomy, almost always done by a cardiac surgeon, usually with cardiopulmonary bypass, and it's associated with significant blood loss. There's often associated pulmonary, cardiac, and neurologic morbidity associated with open repair of this injury, and historically pretty poor operative mortalities. That's 28% in high volume centers. And the paraplegia risk is 16% in high volume centers as well. So in 2011, the Journal of Vascular Surgery had a paper that looked at a meta-analysis, multi-center patient population. Over 7,000 patients were reviewed in 139 studies. 9% mortality rate in the patients that underwent endovascular, almost 20% in the patients that underwent open repair. And for those patients who were non-operative treatment, it was as high as 46%. And the conclusion was that endovascular repair was associated with better survival, decreased risk of spinal cord ischemia, renal injury, and less systemic and graft infection. And the opinions and the conclusions based on grade 2 evidence was that urgent endovascular repair was indicated following stabilization of other injuries. There was conclusions for minimal aortic injuries, such as the small intimal tears, that you could safely observe these patients, and that's what we've seen in practice, actually. So along came thoracic endovascular repair, the first one being done in Stanford for aortic aneurysm disease in 1995. And since that time, it started to evolve in the management of trauma. We were shy in treating young patients, especially with this, but now it's the standard of care, and young and old get consideration of thoracic endovascular repair, even pediatric patients. The problem with pediatric patients is you sometimes don't have the size of stent grafts available for the pediatric population. It's a rapidly evolving technology. We now have second and third generation thoracic endovascular stent grafts that conform better to the aortic arch, that have lower profile. We also have the advent of side branch devices that you can actually deploy a side branch device so that you can now put a stent graft in the subclavian artery, and you don't necessarily have to cover the subclavian artery and exclude it. The advantage is that it avoids the morbidity of a thoracotomy, avoids having to do an aortic cross clamp and cardiopulmonary bypass. And it's a misunderstanding that it's a significantly decreased risk of stroke and spinal cord ischemia, because we're covering the intercostal arteries, because there's a possibility that we are covering subclavian artery and therefore the vertebral artery. Things like stroke and spinal cord ischemia still occur with endovascular stent grafts of blunt thoracic aortic injuries. The current technology approved by the FDA includes the 3 major companies, Gore, Medtronic, and Turamo. Cook is another major company. I would be a liar to you if I told you I didn't use Cook for thoracic tears. I do, even though it's an off-label use. There is some advantage, especially to the Alpha Thoracic device, because it's much lower profile, and it's especially good in women as well as the teenage population because of its lower profile. So this is a case that my colleague did recently, as you come in. Slowly go through. There's the traumatic tear in the proximal thoracic aorta. You know, with untrained eyes, you might actually miss that, and you have to really look. It's a classic looking grade 2 into a grade 2 injury, grade 2 to grade 3. It's really a pseudoaneurysm, grade 3 injury of the proximal thoracic aorta, with relatively few associated injuries. Here's the sagittal. And I'll just show that to you there. Again, even on the sagittal, it's even less obvious, but there it is on the inferior portion of the arch. My colleague took the patient to the OR, delayed repair after 48 hours, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And here is his intraoperative angiogram. And here he chose to use the Medtronic endovascular stent graft. It really is surgeon preference. Often it's about what you usually use in your elective practice. So this particular surgeon often uses Medtronic for his elective infrarenal aneurysm and thoracic aneurysm repair. So he's going to use what he's most comfortable with, in this case, the Valiant thoracic graft from Medtronic. So there he's done the angiogram, he's put the device up. You can see the wire well into the ascending aorta on the contralateral femoral axis. He's got a pigtail for the angiography. And if we go to the next, there's his angiogram showing the supraaortic vessels. And now he's done a partial deployment. And after deploying partially, he does another angiogram. And what we do often in this is we take out the parallax. So he wants to make sure that those stent markers on the proximal ring are all lined up. And that way he takes out the parallax that the C-arm fluoroscopy, the image intensifier, makes with the angle. If those figure of 8 markers are all offset, he can correct that with the changing the angulation and then repeating the angiogram, and he can be much more accurate at where he deploys that graft. So at this point, he's only deployed partially. He can actually pull this graft a little bit further down. And here he's now deployed the entire stent graft, unsheathed it. He still has the proximal clasp on it. The bare stent is not deployed, so he still has the ability to pull it back if he wants to, but it all looks pretty good. And so he's going to let the entire stent graft go. And that's what we see in this image here. He has good filling of the subclavian artery and good filling of the supraaortic trunk with excellent exclusion of the pseudoaneurysm. So this is a stent graft that I use in probably the majority of cases, maybe 50 to 60. I still use Medtronic and Gore, but I've changed, Medtronic and Cook, but I have changed to the Gore graft. And this is an example of some of the 2nd and 3rd generation advancements. Have a look at this deployment. This is actually the first trigger after it's deployed. You can see it actually deploys only 50%. And that gives you the option of being able to push it forward or bringing it back. And then once you've corrected for the parallax, you can now deploy it. And now the deployment is from distal to proximal. And that's how the Gore thoracic stent graft works. So here's a patient who had another high-speed motor vehicle accident, some associated injuries, had fractures as well as thoracic spine fractures. And you can see it's subtle right there. There's the pseudoaneurysm. You can see the linear tear, and there's the pseudoaneurysm associated with hemothorax. And so he was brought to the OR, and we treated him with a Gore thoracic stent graft. And I want to show you what happens when you get a little overconfident. This is looks like we've taken out the parallax. To me, it looked like a pretty good point to do the final trigger wire. I'm going to play this angiogram again. You can see the subclavian artery there. There's some movement with respiration. And so we let the graph go, and I want you to show you, look what the angiogram shows. We don't see the subclavian artery anymore. So clearly we've covered the subclavian artery. But the nice thing about this graph, even though the proximal is deployed, we still have control of the distal end. And so we were able to pull it forward, or sorry, distally, by about 5 millimeters. And then you can see as we repeat the angiogram, now we have good filling of the subclavian artery. This was a frank rupture. So this is a grade 4 injury. As you can see, large amount of hemothorax, complete disruption of the proximal thoracic aorta. I'm going to slow that down. There you go. Extravasation at the level of the isthmus. And clearly that's an urgent emergency that needs to go to the OR sooner than later. Here's the coronal. Again, you can appreciate the large amount of hemothorax as well as the severity and grade of the injury at the level of the proximal thoracic aorta. You can see the extravasation right there. And he was treated with a Gore stent graft, and you can see the non-contrast. I had trouble bringing up the contrast enhanced, but you see the Gore stent graft excluding the injury. So here's the classification again. Intimal or peri-adventitial defects or hematomas are often called minimal aortic injuries. Grade 1 is intimal tear, grade 2 intramural hematoma, grade 3 pseudoaneurysm, and grade 4 rupture. Grade 1s can be safely observed most of the time. Grade 4s are an urgent emergency that need to go to the hybrid room immediately. And grade 2 and 3 can sometimes be delayed repair, but should be repaired before their discharge. So what are the problems with thoracic endovascular repair? We have different types of aortic arches, type 1 to 3, depending on the age of the patient. As you get older, your arch tends to unfold and you become a more difficult type 3 arch, and it can be difficult for some of these stent grafts to conform to the aortic arch. Another problem with thoracic endovascular repair is the frequent need to cover the left subclavian artery. It's an uncertain natural history. We were really concerned about this 15 to 20 years ago when we first started using this, but one of the problems, as you all know, is these trauma patients don't follow up. But I will tell you, it's universal with the vascular surgeon's practice. We see very few complications of trauma patients coming back who've had a remote history of a thoracic endovascular traumatic tear repair. Very few patients are seen coming back with problems. So clearly it's got some long-term benefit. We just don't have very good studies. Nobody knows the optimal follow-up for these patients. I'll talk a little bit about some of the disadvantage of radiologic follow-up, especially in these young patients. And then the question is about systemic heparinization. What do you do for these patients who have associated injuries? So the timing of repair, the Eastern Association for Surgery of Trauma recommended delayed repair in hemodynamically stable patients with no signs of impending rupture. The Society of Vascular Surgery recommended urgent repair within 24 hours. One of the things that really answered this question for us was a publication recently in March of 2021. This group looked at the National Trauma Data Bank, looking at patients from 2012 to 2017. Two groups, group 1, less than 24 hours, group 2, greater than 24 hours, delayed repair. Overall mortality was 8.4%. Interestingly enough, 75% of those patients were treated within the first 24 hours. However, the mortality was twice the amount, or 2 times greater in the patients treated in the less than 24 hours. So was this a selection bias? Well, the mortality benefit persisted across the injury severity scores and was independent of the presence of serious extrathoracic injuries. And logistic regression analysis adjusted for things like age, Glasgow Coma Scale, and their presenting systolic blood pressure less than 90. So they showed a higher adjusted mortality in the group 1 group that was less than 24 hours, furthering evidence that these patients should probably be delayed repair. So at OHSU, we first treat them with anti-impulse blood pressure therapy to decrease their shear forces on their aortic wall. We target their blood pressure less than 120. If there's no other serious concomitant aortic injuries, TVAR in less than 24 hours is warranted. However, if there is associated injuries, we have no problems delaying their repair as long as it's not a grade 4 rupture. The lower grade, grade 1 injuries can be safely surveilled. Again, you risk losing these patients to follow-up, so you have to be really careful about who you are choosing to just treat conservatively. Some of the unmet needs, again, as we said, Pilgrim, arch conformation, again, I think those problems are going to be met in the next 5 to 10 years with better conformable grafts, that as we move higher up in the arch for other pathology, we're going to start to see more branch grafts being used for trauma to be able to treat the subclavian artery and not have to cover it. I think we're already seeing more and more sizes available in the smaller sizes that we can use in the pediatric and population, as well as in the smaller female population with smaller aortas. And graft sizing is certainly surgeon dependent, but what we know that is different than the aneurysm patients is we don't have to have generous 20% oversizing. We can get away with just 10 to 15% oversizing. Anesthesia, it's really surgeon preference. I prefer general anesthesia because I think you have a more cooperative patient. Often these patients are in a lot of pain from associated injuries, so general is preferred. That being said, you can do these patients under local anesthesia if there's a good enough reason. We always have this problem. We usually will fully heparinize these patients when we put these devices in. But in a multi-injured trauma patient, you may want to do this either with a lower dose or sometimes with no heparin. And in those patients, I will do a groin femoral artery cut down so that I can at least flush the femoral artery proximally and distally at the end before closing them, so I can minimize the risk of thrombus formation in the access artery. The optimal follow-up strategy. All this depends on the age of the patient. We have to be really mindful. There's some pretty good studies coming out that we have not done a good job of being mindful about how much radiation exposure and cancerous risk that we're putting these patients. So we have to be thoughtful about the cumulative radiation exposure. We have to be thoughtful about how much contrast we're giving them over their lifetime. What are we doing these radiologic surveillance for? It's to detect late endograft collapse, but we really haven't seen it much in this patient population. We've been doing blunt thoracic aortic endovascular repair for 20 years. And then of course, as you get older, your aorta tends to dilate. And so who knows, we may be missing that window, and maybe in the next 10 to 15 years, we are going to see those patients who had a traumatic tear 20 years ago show up with problems. And just briefly, blunt abdominal aortic injury, it's a rare phenomenon. Less than 1% of all blunt trauma injuries are blunt abdominal aortic injuries. They're challenging because they're clearly associated with other injuries and hemodynamic instability. A very conscientious vascular surgeon at the UW in Seattle did a collaboration with the Journal of Trauma and the Western Trauma Association, looking at a multi-center trial, 113 patients with blunt abdominal aortic injury, 67% were male, median age 38 years with a median ISS score of 34. Most common associated injuries were spine fractures, pneumo and hemothorax, solid organ injury in 40%, small bowel in 35%. Blunt abdominal aortic injury presents as free aortic rupture in a third of patients, pseudoaneurysm in 16%, and minor injuries in the form of intimal flaps or intimal tears in 34 and 18% respectively. Interestingly, we don't have that same threshold for going to endovascular repair with the blunt abdominal aortic injuries, mainly because they're often associated with other injuries that require a laparotomy. So we're seeing 43% incidence of open repair of blunt abdominal aortic injuries compared to 15% for the endo. And as I mentioned, intimal tears are often managed non-operatively with surveillance. Blunt traumatic aortic injuries of the ascending aorta. This was a good study done in September 2013. 47% associated with motor vehicles, 41% associated with motorcycle injuries, and associated injuries in the chest included myocardial contusion in 40%, aortic valve injury in 12%, and severe head injury, not surprisingly, in the majority of patients. In-hospital mortality was a disturbingly high 53%, and with the ascending aortic injury being the direct cause of death in almost 50% of patients. So I'd like to finally thank Jamie and the society for giving me the opportunity to speak. I hope to see you all next year on the slopes, and hopefully we'll all be just sticking with ski masks and not N95. Be happy to answer any questions.
Well, thank you very much. Mallory Williams actually does all the work. I just send emails. And while we're waiting for people to get queued up, when I saw diagrams of these sorts of things being repaired, they frequently weren't from trauma, but they came from Houston. And Stanley Crawford's name was on a lot of those papers. And I wonder what he would think about where we are now.
Well, you know, I never met Dr. Crawford, but I have met Joe Caselli and Hasim Safi, who both trained under Crawford. And the stories that they tell about Dr. Crawford, I don't think I want to have a conversation with him about the open repair versus endovascular repair of a thoracic trauma, but I suspect even Dr. Crawford would be like Dr. Caselli and Safi. I think they all agree that the difference in mortality is clear enough. The endovascular repair is definitely the way to go with these.
I was sort of teasing you, but I was struck by the figures and the results, obviously, and they're quite spectacular. But also the evolution of the endovascular approach. You know, you had the subclavian done. Mallory and I were sitting there going, it's like, yeah, whatever, you know, take the subclavian and do a jump graft from the carotid the next day, which was done at one point, and things have gotten so much better. It's really quite impressive.
Yeah, endovascular repair is fantastic. The only problem is we're slowly training ourselves out of being able to be good open vascular surgeons.
Yeah, I greatly enjoyed the talk. Thank you for coming. Thank you for bringing the angiograms, which are so helpful for surgeons. Two questions, really. Demetriades came to the college, gave the Scudder oration, and basically said we've crossed the Rubicon. In fact, endovascular repair was the standard. And that was hard news to give to some of the trauma surgeons in the audience. But we have, in part, begrudgingly accepted this. Talk to me about surveillance, endograft surveillance in young people that are growing, and there's obviously going to be graft vessel differentials. And then the second question really deals with this idea of delayed repair, particularly in the patient with concomitant traumatic brain injury. So you have competing interests, the aorta and the brain.
Sure. Thanks. I'll address the first question with respect to radiographic surveillance. You know, unanswered question, really. So much of the patient population that is involved with high-speed trauma and the associated use of alcohol, these patients often just don't follow up. So I think it's going to take studies. We are embarking on a study looking at specifically, which might address your second question. We are looking at traumatic brain injury associated with blunt thoracic aortic trauma. And what we're finding is we really only have 30% of patients that are following up. And then you take that and you take patients, are patients really going to follow up? If you're an 18-year-old, are you going to follow up every 2 years with a CT? Probably not. But now we're doing a better job. As before, we used to tell them they were going to have get CT every year. Now we're telling them, we need you to have a CT at 1 year, and then we're going to decide if we can stretch it out to 5 years or 10 years or 20 years. And that seems to be actually increasing our follow-up. People are all of a sudden saying, okay, I'd be willing to do that. But if you start telling a patient that they need to have a CT every 6 to 12 months and then every year thereafter, most of them are not going to come back, or most of them cannot afford anything like that, you know? With respect to the traumatic brain injury, you're right, they're competing problems. We have the neurosurgeons who sometimes want hypertension. We have the vascular surgeons who want to keep their blood pressure low. So there's competing issues there. The traumatic brain injuries that need to have an operation or at least any kind of intervention without heparin, those are competing values with vascular surgery, who wants to treat these traumatic tears and also give heparin in order to prevent thrombus formation. And I mentioned in the talk, I think with experience, you get more and more comfortable at doing these repairs without heparin. And the nice thing about it is, now that we have 3rd and 4th generation grafts, they are low profile. We now have a graft that's 16 French. So we're not actually occluding any flow in the femoral and iliac artery. So that's even more evidence that we don't need to give them heparin anymore. We are not aggressive with the traumatic brain injuries of fixing their thoracic aorta. We're more aggressive at just surveilling them while we try to figure out, is their brain injury going to be their final event, or are they actually going to get better?
I've actually seen the aorta in a delayed circumstance fully remodeled. The intima reattached to the media and really remodeled when it has not been repaired, and blood pressure control with beta blocker therapy has been instituted for a prolonged period of time. Have you seen that as well?
Yeah, I mean, the grade 1 minimal aortic injury in a traumatic thoracic tear is akin to a very local type B dissection. And we see remodeling in that patient population. And I think now that a lot of us are following these grade 1 tears, we definitely see remodeling.
Cherry, on a related note.
This is Ed. We're 10 minutes over.
Oh, I'm sorry. Never mind.
So talk quick.
Just wanted to know that the role of postoperative beta blockers and aspirin inhibitors in a patient population that get their graft for trauma, you know, with all the challenges that compliance presents, do you still make a point of post-op management with those drugs?
It depends. The ones that we have difficult a time with are the ones who are already hypertensive. The young patients, as soon as their pain settles, they tend to go back to being normotensive. So I don't think we have as many problems with the younger patients controlling their blood pressure postoperatively.
Well, thank you all very much. And I think we're all impressed by the combination of anatomy, physiology, technique, and technology. And the next time I get my aorta disrupted, I'll make sure to do it in Portlandia.
You're always welcome, Jamie.
We have another talk here, and I'm not 100% sure it's going to work, but we're going to try. Dr. Camp has been so kind as to agree to address us on care of thoracic organ donors. And you'll remember last time he was trying to become a thoracic organ donor when he had a little bit of a hard landing in his plane. You'll notice the schedule's pretty different in reality from what we said was going to happen. And his very weak excuse is an hour and a half ago, he said he was going to be tied up for a little while because he was putting someone on ECMO. And so that has now been accomplished. And if you have some lungs to donate, he's the guy tonight. He has someone who needs it. And along those lines, he's even willing to throw in the talk on how to care for the donor. Phil, I'm glad you could make it. Give it a shot.
Yeah, apologies for being late. Hopefully I am sharing the right slides. You tell me if that's not the case.
Can hear you, and we have a slide that says Spectrum Health that is the appropriate slideshow view.
Well, I'm very excited. Apologies, I changed my position here, and when I requested this meeting off, I was informed, no problem, you're fifth in line. You'll notice I'm on call, and getting to enjoy the miracle of ECMO. My only recommendation is make sure you get your vaccines. We're going to talk today sort of about sort of donor management and why in the sort of trauma surgery realm would you even consider this a topic of interest. Hopefully I'll show that your impact is important in this sort of area. We're going to talk about some ultimately medical management of organ donors and why that can be important. As everyone knows, a couple of years ago, moved to Michigan. This is our facility. We are the largest facility in Western Michigan, and we keep kind of busy. Apparently we like ECMO. So we're going to discuss the issue of the shortfall of available organs in transplant and how we as surgeons can affect that through our care, the impact of trauma surgeons and what you do and how you can affect patients who are under your care and unfortunately not going to be saved. And then we'll discuss some of the areas where excellent, good ICU care can make significant improvements in organ donation and in organ function. So why discuss this with trauma surgeons? Well, here's a breakdown of where, what mechanisms lead to organ donation. And you'll notice the bright red and the not so bright red, all areas where this is sort of the domain of trauma and acute care surgeons. A large portion of those who go on to ultimately save lives through donation are going to come through your acute care and your trauma service. And you're going to be taking care of these folks up to this point. And as I can show you, how you take care of them both while trying to resuscitate them and then after you have made a determination that we can't save them has an impact on literally thousands of lives. The color doesn't project well, but of all of the possible places that organ donors come from, the pinkish circle is sort of those who go on to actually being organ donors. The greenish circle are those folks who ultimately came out of a trauma or acute care setting. And so the ability to impact organ donation and the number of folks who can be saved through it is fairly substantial when we talk about the audience that are attend this meeting and who are sort of members. Every day, the demand for organs increases. We are listing more and more people because we have better and better technology. Unfortunately, the rate of organs available does not match how fast we're growing. And with it, we have a higher responsibility to care for those who might also turn into donors. And I remember when I was younger in training, we said someone was going to pass, we sort of lost interest in them. And I think in this certain current era, as they transition from we're trying to save their life to other, we have to remember that the skills and the knowledge you bring to taking care of that individual doesn't stop when we can no longer save that person's life, because now you're looking at saving many lives potentially just through good care and observation. Graft survival after donation, we know that donors need to be maintained in a normal physiologic condition until the time of donation, and that is an area of expertise of this audience. Surgeons play that vital role in the management of potential organ donors through identification of those donors, like when we recognize we can't save them, maintaining physiology in those folks, and just good, proper medical care, not sort of turning our attention to somebody else because we can't save this individual. If you sort of look at and I apologize, this is a year-old data on the right, but the numbers are current. As of this month, we've got 140,000 people listed for transplantation. Last year, we broke 40,000 transplanted organs and we had 19,000, but that leaves a difference of 100,000 people who are currently listed who are sick enough that they actually went through and got through a process of being listed for transplantation. And that doesn't include the folks who still could benefit from an organ, but don't meet the strict criteria. And as it stands now, 24 people a day die on the list, once they've gone through the whole process and are being maintained at very high-end centers. So what is the impact of any donor? Well, we add one donor every 10 minutes to the list. This is, I updated the 22 to 24 because it has gone up, but that many people die each day waiting. And what probably isn't realized is through both tissue and organ donation, 75 individuals can benefit from a gift from anyone. And so, there's multiple abilities to save lives for every one of these donors. And we as surgeons, especially as trauma surgeons, have the ability to impact, lives in a way that we never really appreciated. But we always we sign off on them. But I think you bring a lot to the opportunity for saving other lives down the road. The solution, we just got to do a better job at recovering more organs and making sure they're viable at the time we do that. There are huge pathophysiological changes that occur at the time of loss of brain function, and we're still taking care of them until that determination is finally made. But we get hypothermia, 100% of patients will get that. Hypotension, nearly 95 to 100% of patients will have that problem. You get DI and fluid changes, you get arrhythmias, you get malperfusion issues, pulmonary edema. And so there's a whole lot of physiology that can be maintained in the setting of brain dysfunction and brain loss of brain function that you are experts at maintaining, and ultimately in managing those, you can take care of improving the lives of recipients. In terms, I'm going to sort of more focus on the cardiopulmonary, but in terms of CV impact from brain death, we all know about the Cushing reflex. When you get pontine ischemia, you're going to start to see bradycardia and hypertension initially. That ultimately, as things progress, leads into intense vasoconstriction. So you see a catechol storm, and then as things redistribute, you start seeing changes in afterload, and with it, visceral ischemia. And so multiple organs can be involved. That catechol surge ultimately leads to a depletion of ATP and cardiac myocytes. We know that 20 to 25% of brain dead donors who are otherwise healthy have clear evidence of myocardial ischemia from this process, and 40% of them will show clear myocardial dysfunction even in the setting of what was normal heart prior to that moment. As ischemia progresses and you start seeing cord components, you're going to see loss of tone. And we see, with this, a compromise in coronary perfusion, organ perfusion, hypoperfusion, and ultimately you see multiple organs have dysfunction from this secondary brain injury on sort of cardiovascular components. From a pulmonary point of view, lungs are most often ruled out, considered unsuitable. Only 10 to 20% of lungs will ultimately be considered appropriate for transplantation. That being said, that is a number because of how we manage the patients, not because of the quality or the function of those lungs prior to all these events. We will see neurogenic pulmonary edema, and we see with it an inflammatory acute lung injury. And those are sort of the two things that really drive the lung injury and dysfunction you see in donors. In a brain dead patient, the neurogenic pulmonary edema is related to that sympathetic storm we talked about, and occurs sort of immediately after the neurologic insult. It can occur earlier depending on how fast things progress, but it's one of the things that often we sort of say, oh, the lungs aren't working very well after the fact because we didn't sort of step in and do our best to control these changes in ways we can. With it, the sympathetic storm obviously causes the vasoconstriction and cardiac afterload, the stress we talked about a minute ago, but it also causes increase in pulmonary blood volume and PA pressure. That leads to atrial and pulmonary pressure changes. You see a fairly significant change in pulmonary capillary pressures, transgradient pressures, and with it, edema. And that elevated hydrostatic pressure leads to structural damage, capillary leak, and dysfunction, which sort of keeps the whole process spiraling when we don't have a chance to try to intervene. Pro-inflammatory mediators are released following brain death. It's one of the biggest sort of initiators of sort of the spiral. And they promote an infiltration of activated neutrophils into the lungs, but predominantly, but all organs. And these lead into essentially a series of ongoing dysfunction. And it looks a lot like chest trauma. It looks a lot like aspiration. It looks a lot like atelectasis. And it's these things that we take care of on a regular basis and that you guys are very good at managing that can be managed in very similar ways when and through this other pathway that causes lung dysfunction. I give you the fancy slide with the much prettier pictures that basically sort of describes the entire process we just talked about. I also recognize that I think I'm the guy between you and dinner, so we're not going to take too much time on it. So what we're trying to do is grow the number of transplanted organs. And so general management of a donor and the donor process is how we do that. Understanding this opportunity and avoiding premature withdrawal of support to possible candidates. And that's where you as surgeons who are good at resuscitating patients, sort of keeping your head in the game. Proper coordination with the families and explaining them what we do. Trying to understand what the OPO is doing. Because sometimes if we sort of get where they're headed, we can help coordinate. And then really continuing full metabolic support of those patients while we decide, we're losing one life, but can we save 3, 5, 10 others? So we're going to talk about some ways to optimize. We're going to look at hemodynamic management, fluids, respiratories, endocrine, and then we'll focus a little bit on infection management, which is a little controversial. So there are some sort of practical aspects of organ donor management, fundamental principles, confirmation of our goals, regular review of the donor's state, meaning we keep an eye on them. They're not just sort of set in the back room because we don't, they're no longer an active patient of ours. And then making sure we step in promptly with changes in therapy as indicated. The medical management of potential brain dead donors is dependent on the discretion of primary critical care teams with coordination of surgeons. And we have great influence and can offer sort of continuity in what we see as considerable variation between different ICUs. And the target of our management is maintain homeostasis, try to promote optimal organ function and with it, maximize the graft viability in that particular person who's going to not only donate, but ultimately, if a recipient gets a more viable organ, they have a better chance of having good function. So maintaining physiology close to normal is what we want to do, and we don't spell patients with a capital T at the end. So it's the sort of rule of 100, systolic arterial pressure greater than 100, urine output greater than 100, arterial pressure, arterial partial pressure of oxygen, PaO2 greater than 100, trying to keep the hemoglobin concentration greater than 100 grams per liter, and then blood sugar is normal. And those are sort of some basic rules of thumb we have. When we look at specifics, temperature management, prevention of hypothermia is something that is often ignored in these patients. And as they get brainstem dysfunction, they do not thermoregulate very well. And it's frankly easier to prevent hypothermia by active warning earlier than to wait until they're cold and try to warm them from that point. So preemptive versus reactive. Surface warming should be performed in all patients with hypothermia and can maintain a temperature of a 35.8 as a rule up to the time that they would go on to organ donation. And active warming can be through anything, warm blankets, fluid warmers, heated humidifiers in your circuits, anything to sort of maintain a normal ambient temperature. In terms of cardiovascular management, you need clear hemodynamic goals. So we want normal volemia, We want controlled blood pressure, not too high, not too low. We want to optimize cardiac output and maintain perfusion pressures of all organs. We often sort of don't think about organ perfusion and taking care of a patient, but what we're trying to do is maintain normal organ function. And then, as much as we can, minimize the use of vasoactive agents. When we see hypertension, it's not that common after brain death, but occasionally we do deal with it. What we try to do is be conservative in our management. So we tend to use a goal of, at least, not more than 90 as a map, but at least 65 to 70, and using short-acting agents. So if you need something, using esmolol or nitroprusside, hydralazine, short-acting drugs that can be easily titrated and turned off when they are no longer appropriate. Systemic hypotension is, however, common, especially after brain death. And as I've got the numbers here, basically every patient will have some episode of it. We look for signs of continuing hemorrhage, and as a trauma surgeon, you're much more attuned to what would be the sources of this and making sure it's being managed. I think, especially when you're dealing with a patient in the ICU, you're going to have better situational awareness on this and can really guide care much more acutely or astutely. We look carefully for medications that can contribute hypotension, making sure we're not being over-aggressive with drugs that are not helping us. So, if we're using beta blockers as they were progressing in brain death, does that need to be backed off, and do we need to coordinate? Essentially what we end up for cardiovascular management is sort of three strategies: volume expansion, vasopressors, inotropes as indicated, and hormonal replacement. And I'll come to some dosing in some of these shortly. In monitoring, a lot of, when you talk to transplant folks, we are a lot more focused on numbers than you might be in a trauma patient. It is not uncommon for us to quickly put in a pulmonary artery catheter, or at least central venous monitoring, and or other non-invasive techniques to monitor the global picture of the patient. That may not be standard for a trauma patient, but if your patient is heading down this path, you're no longer treating one problem, you're trying to maintain organ function, and that additional data, at least in the transplanter's mind, will be helpful. You're going to want serial continuous measurements of central venous pressures. You want PA pressures. Those are all important for lungs and heart more than you know. It's probably one of the reasons why when they don't happen, that lungs are not used as often as they could be. And then in terms of other monitoring, stroke volume, cardiac output, index, mixed venous saturation, these are all going to be key in terms of trying to not only place organs, but making sure that you're truly maintaining a homeostatic state. In terms of volume expansion and fluid management, hypovolemia, common scenario in brain dead donors, especially in those you're taking care of in the trauma realm. So fluid resuscitation is considered probably a first step in managing hypotension. And then there's the debate of what fluid do you use? Different centers have different philosophies, both crystalloid and colloid. And the decision really is one that's going to be local. There is no strong data to support, any particular regimen. The fluids you choose should be to adjust your electrolytes, sugar levels, your hemodynamics, your overall volume level, and dealing with the polyuria from the DI. The only comment that I will add that's not here is it's not unusual for folks to use albumin as a fluid, resuscitation fluid. And at least in terms of organ donation, not a great fluid. The trauma literature is actually one of the best sources of how long does albumin stay inside the active vascular system, and the answer is not long. It quickly migrates out of into the lymphatic system and goes into soft tissue. So if you've got organs that are more susceptible to edema, such as lungs, they're going to be much more boggy and wet in the setting of albumin versus just crystalloid. So recommendations for fluid: crystalloids and balanced salt solutions to avoid hypernatremia. LR is probably most frequently used. 0.9 saline can obviously lead to hypothalamic acidosis, and it does increase some renal vascular resistance. So in the setting of renal transplant may not be your first choice. Making sure that we're not giving with a lot of IV fluid, making sure that we're not giving too much glucose, leading to hyperglycemia, and with it some, a lot of fluids, hypothermia. Colloids, as we've talked about, need to be avoided. The albumin solutions can be used to reduce the amount of fluid administered, but there's a trade-off, and at least in a patient who might be a transplant recipient, it's not our first choice, it's our last choice. In terms of vasoactive agents, many patients are going to be on it. Folks that we take care of and see, 80 to 90% will be on some kind of, inotropic or vasoactive drug, at least partly during the time they're being taken care of. I know that's not a standard trauma regimen, but as they are migrating towards this, you're going to be managing the sort of sequelae of brain death. And this is a way to help deal with that because you've lost that, neural input. There are very widely divergent opinions about which medication to use, and there are no great randomized controlled trials. There are certainly advocates that point to any one of a number of drugs and why they should use it. I think you need to find something that you're comfortable with. Epi, norepi, vasopressin, dopamine, dobutamine are used, fairly consistently. I think you will find in the patients we take care of, norepinephrine is probably more commonly used because the epi will drive the heart rate and tends to not be as wonderful for heart donors. Vasopressin, obviously very good in DI and ends up being a fairly good medication for dilation. Dopamine and dobutamine have not been used much and are really sort of not falling out of favor, but have not been our primary agents. And so, if that's what you're using locally, great, but that wouldn't be my first agent. We do know that high doses of catecholamines and epi in particular can lead to cardiomyopathies in these patients, which is probably why we go more commonly with norepinephrine. There are, again, very few retrospective studies that look at, specific drugs, but vasopressin is highly effective in DI management. And there is good evidence to support that the need for other hemodynamic catechol drugs is reduced in the setting of using vasopressin as one of your primary drugs. And again, the norepinephrine, which is the agent we prefer, does have improved coronary and renal blood flow, which probably is protective in some effect. Again, not a large study, but definitely informative. And again, I can't point to a good study and say, follow this one religiously, because there are none that are definitive. Hormonal therapy is something that you probably have not dealt with much, but is very common and very important in these patients, especially the brain dead patients, because you essentially have lost your entire, brainstem, and with it, all the standard influences on your body. So in transplant land, we call it the triple therapy, and usually some combination of methylprednisolone, vasopressin, and T3 and or T4. There is a little controversy with T3, T4. Honestly, half the centers believe in it, half don't. But as a rule, these are sort of the three primary hormonal therapies that are used in these patients. And there have been some studies that when using this combination, you're more likely to have organ stability, reasonable organ function, and with it, more likely to save somebody's life by having successful organ donation. Vasopressin, 1 unit bolus followed by an infusion, methylpred 15 per kilo, followed at brain death, and then subsequent doses. Insulin to maintain glucose between 80 and 150. T3, T4 as written. And again, the T4 improves the hemodynamic status and does prevent cardiovascular collapse. I can tell you that we will commonly see a brain dead donor and who has an EF of 35, 40%, and in an otherwise healthy individual, when you give them T3, T4 for 12 hours, suddenly they have an EF of 55 to 60% just by returning the hormonal stimulation. In terms of respiratory management, I'm going to just point to a couple of things. Peak airway pressures, ideally under 40, plateaus under 35. Your FiO2, you need it enough to keep above 92%, and ideally to keep your PaO2 greater than 70%. PEEP 5, unless you're the patient I just took care of who has uses the 10 is the new 5. So but your goal again is to maintain a PaO2 of 70 or greater. In patients who have bad lung disease but you're managing them, have your respiratory therapist watch for auto PEEP, so you're not over PEEPing them by accident. And for goals 7.35 to 4.5, your PaCO2 greater than 16, 11 less than 60 millimeters to maintain pH, PaO2 greater than 70, and then bicarb, adjusted as needed. We, are good at sort of thinking about ongoing processes in the airway. I'm a big fan of airway management. Respiratory passages need to be cleaned and sort of routinely checked and suctioned. These folks sometimes, especially trauma patients, are sort of left because they're broken. We don't want to hurt them. But airways that are injured secrete stuff and they tend to get plugged up. And then atelectasis and fluid resuscitation leads to additional hypoxia. You get stasis. So working on making sure that the lungs are fully inflated and that you're dealing with these secondary processes is the way to make sure that someone who could be a donor does become a donor. We also recognize that lung injury and inflammation may occur through prolonged ventilation. So we do our best to maintain, low peak pressures. We maintain reasonable PEEP. We do what we can do to maintain our maintenance. And in the setting of doing those interventions, we have been able to show that the prolonged ventilation injury that we often see is usually avoided by just good respiratory toilet. And then many of you may not be folks who deal with bronchs, but bronchoscopy is something that should be utilized liberally in these patients. In terms of infectious disease,
4 minutes.
4 minutes. In infectious disease, short answer, treat potential stuff, avoid nephrotoxic drugs, but there's no protocol that says they should be covering everything under the, God's green earth. It's, make sure that just common sense stuff is being taken care of, treat anything positive, but you do not need to broadly cover them with stuff. And then, it sometimes is counterintuitive, but the body is going to need continuous nutrition. So don't forget, these patients need to have ongoing management. They need to be fed and you need to take care of the ongoing nutritional needs until the point in time when either they become a donor or not. So brain death induces this marked physiologic response. The hemodynamic and respiratory management of these donors really doesn't differ that much from management of a critically ill patient. And the focus on substrate supply and consumption and avoiding, therapy-induced issues is how we take care of, regular patients. It's the same in these patients. There are specific endocrine therapies, as we talked about, that are definitely linked with improved function and improved donation and ultimately improved function in the recipient. Infections really have got more to do with risk of transmission, and it's not something special. Just treat what you see. And, a lot of the management strategies in brain dead neurons, we don't have strong evidence, so we extrapolate what we know from good ICU management. And when we do, we have better outcomes. And in my time left over, thank you.
What a fantastic talk. And it's nice to know that you practice what you preach. You're talking to us and taking care of sick people who need transplants. And you give us a way out. And as someone whose only professional Christmas card for years used to come from the New England Organ Bank. I'm delighted to see one of our own members out there doing the right thing. We have time for one question.
So, innovation and technology into the transplant world in the University of Maryland. What are your thoughts about the application for that transplanted heart being utilized for lungs?
If you look at the conceptual basis of what they're doing, honestly, it makes sense. What you're essentially doing is getting rid of cell markers that are the reason why you see hyperacute rejection in xenotransplant. And the next logical step is then transfecting those same cells with standard markers from a specific individual. I think, I have guarded optimism. I've watched xenotransplantation for a long time. We'll see what happens. I think ultimately it's going to be a way in that we can start transplanting people who, quote, aren't sick enough to be on the current transplant list. They're still sick enough to need a transplant. It's just we've had to create such high benchmarks because there's just so few organs. And if we can generate, a set of organs that have acceptable function and don't require, super therapeutic immune suppression because
Thank you so much, Dr. Camp. We're going to move to our next talk. Fortunate enough, the society is fortunate enough to welcome Mike Marolt in the audience, and we want to welcome here to the Rocky Mountain Traumatological Society. I talk, and that's okay because it's going to be fun for me. I'm going to pick up where EJ left off and kind of provoke a little conversation amongst some senior experienced surgeons. The title of the talk is "Where Have You Laid Him? Acid Reduction Procedures and Modern Surgical Training." So thoracic surgeons can kind of be on board with this talk. It's really one of philosophical standpoint on surgical training as well as technical ability. I have no disclosures I'm still working on. I think the title comes from John chapter 11, 34 verse, where the sum of the total says, "He groaned in the spirit and was troubled and said, 'Where have you laid him?'" The he, of course, is the master, Jesus Christ. He's visiting Mary, his long friend, and the subject matter of the conversation is the death of Lazarus and why did he tarry longer in the neighboring town before coming back to save his dear friend. Many of us who are in the business of not just doing surgery, but actually training surgeons have groaned in our spirits and are greatly troubled by what we see in modern surgical training. We somewhat feel helpless as to what we can do to make a difference and make it better, but we have a sense, an instinct that indeed something is wrong. I'm going to use acid reduction procedures as a context for which to engage in the broader discussion. And so when we talk about acid reducing procedures, why have we all of a sudden walked away from the physiology that we developed and what we know about these procedures and the great men and people who helped develop our understanding? Lester Dragstad, Mathieu Jaboulet, even Pavlov, Andre Latiger, Walter von Heinecke, and Johann von Michaelis-Radecki, all seminal figures in surgery that have helped us understand acid production, intestinal or cure ulcer diathesis. If we look at vagotomies performed in the United States hospitals, this is work that was put together for me by Dr. Zainuddin. who's also with us virtually. And we look at the number of vagotomies that are being performed in US hospitals, the total being in blue here, from 1997 to 2014, you see an 82% reduction in the number of vagotomies that we are performing. And if you look at teaching hospitals, that would be the places where our trainees are learning how to do such a procedure. You will see that from 97 to 2014, there has been a 75% reduction in vagotomies. And I would argue strongly that a significant percentage of those reductions are justified by what we know, not all. And so why also, we know that results in relative hypergastrinemia, development of H. pylori by Marshall, with the understanding of H. pylori by Marshall and Warren, which they received the Nobel in 1984, is a powerful new understanding. We know
We seem to have lost Dr. Williams. Bear with us.
So we talked about the powerful new understandings, but furthermore, I think beyond that, we also have interesting advice coming from the, if you will, Bible of general surgery. It says the effectiveness of PPIs and the recognized morbidity of vagotomy have essentially eliminated the indication for vagotomy today. This is what our residents are reading in their major surgical texts. I think at Howard University, we have a slightly different perspective, and that perspective is shaped heavily by our patient population. So we recognize the role, one, of social determinants in health, and we screen patients for those social determinants, i.e. health status and the ability to afford PPIs, which are not inexpensive medications at all when you start talking about putting someone on a PPI for life. Is that really a relevant intervention for uninsured, disadvantaged patients in this country? We provide patient-centered surgical care and make acid-reducing procedures available for patients when it is appropriate. In other words, if I have a homeless patient, I don't think talking about a gram patch and doing a BPI for the rest of their life is really sane, logical care by the surgeon. When we look at the long-term metrics of this, we see that there were 570,000 people from 2005 to 2014 in the patient we published, and most of the complications were hemorrhage, which are endoscopically controlled today. And again, that's no problem, but 11% are still perforation and 2% are obstructive in nature in terms of anatomical obstructions. When we look at these operative procedures, we see that in 2005, we were doing 26% operative procedures. Remember, PPIs came on board and widely available at the end of the 80s. 2014, that had been cut to 14%. And when we look at each indication for the complicated peptic ulcer disease, you can see each of them have, in terms of the operative management, were decreased. And when we look at acid reducing procedures, we see we went from 26% in 2005 to 14% in 2014. And I would just simply ask, even with PPIs being available and being rational standards of care, patients suffering from a high acid diastasis? And the answer to that question, I think most of us would agree, is no. And so I fundamentally believe we have to be situated in a competency-based surgical philosophical approach. And that would be for any profession that you would be involved in, is that we are really producing professionals of the highest competency that are able really to produce clinical outcomes that will be exceptional for all of the American people, irrespective of the package that they may come in. What Charles Mayo said was this, and I thought that this was excellent. It was before his time. He said, if anyone shall consider moving half of my good stomach to cure a small ulcer in my duodenum, I would run faster than he. I thought that was rational based upon our knowledge of ulcer disease, and you know, vagotomy and antrectomy is a great operation, but certainly comes with significant morbidity and probably can be avoided in many instances. But what I would say to Dr. Mayo, and this is Dr. Williams speaking, it is no longer a concern, Dr. Mayo. Today's general surgery resident would never consider such an idea, for they have neither been trained to understand the anatomy or perform the procedure. And so where we have arrived at in general surgery training is in fact a narrower perspective of a disease and a patient population based upon a narrow scope of training that we are providing the patient. And I am talking about acid reduction procedure. My orthopedic surgeon colleagues on the webinar can surely talk probably about pelvic surgery in the same light. My plastic surgery and plastic and reconstructive surgery colleagues probably have a disease that is that can take on the same context in terms of discussion. So I want to talk about why we got to continue to train good surgery residents. We have uninsured patients in this country, and that's okay. We've got non-compliant patients in this country. We have non-compliant patients that are not non-compliant because they want to be non-compliant. We got non-compliant patients because they have mental illness that prevents them from being compliant. So they have a rational reason to be non-compliant. They too will still need care in terms of their ulcer disease. And then we have intractable peptic ulcer disease. That is ulcer disease that after 6 to 8, whatever definition you want to use, or 12 weeks of care and re-endoscopy is still showing to be complicated and impacting the patient. So we understand that there is a context by which we still need to be able to offer patient surgery. And we understand that these are the criteria that these patients must meet in order to receive high efficacious surgery. They have to have failed active medical training. They need to have some complication. We don't want to advocate doing morbid procedures on patients just because we know how to do them. We do want to tailor our surgical skill sets to appropriately meet the needs of the patient population that comes to us, irrespective of the social context in which they arrive. And I think that that's the point that we're trying to arrive at, and that would be in Appalachia or Washington, D.C. What you see here is a patient that I ran across. Clearly, this is a duodenal ulcer right at D1, right after the pylorus. It's a high acid ulcer. You ask most surgical residents today, how would you manage this patient? By the way, I'm sorry for being rude. The top of this patient's head is right here, and the bottom of the patient's legs is down here where you see my hand holding the DeBakey's. And of course, this is the hole in the duodenum after it has been somewhat exposed. Will say, I patch. And even if you ask them, well, what is a Graham patch? They would say, take a pedicle of in fact, it is described by Seeland and Jones and was not described by Graham. Seeland and Jones described a pedicle omental patch in 1929. And in fact, Graham described the Graham patch in 1937, and he never closed the hole. He simply inserted the omentum over the hole and then put the omentum, fixed the omentum there with suture for his repair. And so even understanding what they are doing when they choose to do non-acid reducing procedures is problematic in our surgical resident population. That's something that we ought to need to and can correct. This is a pedicle omental flap that you see right here. I did not do a pedicle omental flap for the patient that I just showed you, but this is an example of a pedicle omental flap that I have done in a patient. You see a silk suture there holding the pedicle omentum in place. And you can see already that there's a pin rose around that esophagus because this patient has been pre-resuscitated before they went to the operating room. I have hemodynamic stability. I have a urinating patient who is prepared to do an acid reducing procedure because he's been screened for the context, and it's clear to me he can benefit from a vagotomy in terms of his long-term ulcer care. So this is what Graham described. Graham described actually a free omental patch where you took omentum and then you pushed it over the hole and then secured it in place. You will notice that that omentum that is over the ulcer is not still attached to his blood supply. These are the Graham diagrams that describe his procedure. Here again, you have an ulcer in place, and one can argue about whether or not to you just go ahead on and do a gram patch and put the patient on ulcer therapy, come back and scope them. But again, if you haven't asked the questions, if you don't know the social determinants, the answers that you come up with may fit your skill set, not necessarily what the patient needs. And so what are we advocating for? What am I advocating for here in terms of surgical training? Residents probably will never know how to do a highly selective ergotomy. We don't do enough of them in this nation. The meticulous nature of this procedure in terms of the lysing of the nerves along a lesser curvature, such that you denervate the parietal mass, is something that is of technical difficulty, and you got to do it. And that's not what we're talking about. What I am talking about is the trunco-selective ergotomy. Got to know how to do that. Got to know how to find the anterior vagus nerve, and got to know how to find the posterior vagus nerve. And you got to be able to take 2-3 centimeters of that nerve when you find it and send it off to pathology for a specimen in order to decrease acid production in that patient by some 80% if it is done correctly and the denervation is appropriate. Here you see me with a mixture in my hand, what you might call a right angle. And I'm pointing toward the anterior vagus nerve by pulling down on the anterior stomach. And you can see I've got 2 silks in the right picture around here, 2 silks around that anterior branch. And I'm about to lyse that, tag it, set it off for pathology, and then go get the posterior nerve by taking the pin rose, swinging it to the lateral left upper quadrant, putting my hand behind that esophagus and feeling for the violin string that would be the posterior vagus nerve, and also do the same there. There's good data that if you were to do this procedure laparoscopically, certainly a Taylor procedure could do a laparoscopic posterior truncal ergotomy and then come do an anterior selective ergotomy along the lesser curve. That is fine. I would just simply say that you need to make sure that the patient's in appropriate condition for that in terms of the contamination from the ulcer diathesis before proceeding in that direction. This is the Heineke-Mikowitz pyloroplasty, and that is a longitudinal incision, including the ulcer through the pylorus with a vertical incision with a horizontal closure. And of course, that a drainage procedure needs to be attached to a vagotomy for obvious reasons. And what you will see is that I will take my pyloroplasty here. This is before I think I canaled this and then did an inverting stitch. And I'll even take and put some fat over the pyloroplasty just to reinforce it. There's no greater blood supply than it is to the duodenal complex. So this is overkill, not need to be done, but this is something that I will do from time to time. So what are we advocating really at, what is the acute care surgery, which we call the Matori service at Howard University, which I lead, advocating? Well, we're talking about early identification of these patients, free air with a good history, maybe even a contrast study with extravasation. We're getting these patients lined up, putting Foley's and nasogastric tubes, but they're screening for that social determinants. Is patient insured? What kind of insurance do they have? Are they going to be able to take a lesser operation and long-term medical therapy? Is that within their capabilities? Starting them on IV antibiotics, certainly, and some people might even add a fungal agent for upper tract perforations. I wouldn't be mad at you at all. We put these patients in the ICU, and then we pre-resuscitate them to goals of resuscitation so that by the time we're getting in the operating room, we don't have that easy out of, oh, the patient's hemodynamically unstable, or, oh, this patient's not doing well. We're preparing this patient for a definitive operation should they need it. Not all patients will need one. If they can just get a gram patch, then that's fine. But clearly, if they're not in a position for long-term management with just a gram patch or omental pedicle flap, we're preparing these patients for a definitive acid-reducing procedure, which in my hands is going to be a truncal or selective ergotomy and a Heineke-Mikowitz pyloroplasty or pyloroplasty or a Finney pyloroplasty. This is what we do for most of our perforated ulcers. This is certainly what me and Dr. Cornwell do. I have a 6-man group. Not everybody subscribes to it, and we don't make them subscribe to it. But we fundamentally believe of our general surgery's armamentarium. And what we have found in a paper that we just submitted is that when you look at mortality in these patients, in terms of who lives and who dies, patients who get acid-reducing procedures in institutions that tend to do a lot of them, okay, tend to have a survival advantage. I don't expect them to have a complication advantage when compared, as these numbers are, to gram patches. Okay, these numbers are compared to non-acid reducing procedures. So I expect for the odds ratio to exceed 1, and there'll be excess morbidity here because it's a bigger procedure. But in the hands of people who can do the acid reducing procedure and are very comfortable with it, I think the data clearly shows that patients do better than those patients receiving non-acid reducing procedures. And so we are advocating that this remain in the general surgeon's purview, that we continue to train our residents to do this on behalf of our patient population. It's a part of what a good surgical resident training needs to be. It's part of patient-centered care as well, which is a part of the 6 domains of quality care rendered in the country. I'll stop there and entertain any questions. Forgive the delay.
Someone must have a question for Mallory's showing us that not only can he solve societal problems, but he's good at time travel too.
Yeah.
Mallory, I thought that was an excellent review and a very pertinent tailoring of the procedure to the patient population. And I will say that in the more rural areas of Western Massachusetts, we have also seen a persistence or a renaissance, if you will, of the ancient techniques for acid suppression. I wouldn't be so quick to throw away the antrectomy, though. In the example you showed, vagotomy and drainage is certainly appropriate. But what about the large ulcer with complex ischemic ends that need to be trimmed, and you find that you have difficulty closing? Would you recommend performance of an antrectomy in that situation?
Oh, I love that question, Ed. Particularly when you look at, so let's go back. When we talk about gram patch, Ed, and this is right, you're right on point when you start talking about our rural populations, which have just the same, if not worse, economic challenges, because they may not even be in proximity of a hospital that's beyond a critical access hospital. But when you really talk about gram patch, I mean, you're not supposed to be putting gram patches on an ulcer greater than 5, maybe 8 millimeters. And you and I know that we've got young surgeons out here throwing fat over anything, right? So when you mention that case that you mentioned about that low and not dismissing antrectomy, that's great stuff, because that really takes us into the next lecture, because you know that in the classic textbook, vagotomy and antrectomy, it had a lower recurrence rate than when you did V&P. And the problem with the highly selective vagotomy is that it had less morbidity, but the recurrence rate on a highly selective vagotomy was north of 28% in some hands. And so you're right. I don't throw away antrectomy at all, and I'm very capable of doing antrectomy. The key is that preoperative preparation, that ICU stay. Not feeling like you got to run to the operating room with everybody who's got some free air, particularly if your contrast is coming out of an upper tract perforation. My chair at Cornwell, his former chair at USC will tell you they did contrast studies on everybody, because 25% of upper tract perforations will seal, and you might not even need to do an operation if the patient doesn't have peritonitis. And so I like to operate, so I kind of sometimes, I'm not really interested in whether it's sealed or not. But I think for the complicated ulcer that's large, okay, listen, antrectomy has an absolute role, and that's something that I think that our trainees would also suffer with. That you start asking them, tell me what lesser curved vesicular bundle do you take the stomach at in terms of a VNA? Where is the parietal cell mass? Where's the antrum end and begin? I think those things we are losing And I don't know that we're losing them with the consensus that this is something that it's okay to lose. I think it subtly happened to us. And I know we still have populations of patients in the country and certainly in the world. I mean, when you look at VMP and VNA in the world, it's still that's a real procedure in the Caribbean. It's a real procedure in developing nations. And so I think we do want to train our surgeons, particularly if they have this global, this desire to do global care, to be able to be relevant in other environments in the Western world. Excellent point.
I think Dr. Abraham would share your 2 steps forward, 1 steps back vibe, since he was describing a very similar evolution in aortic surgery. We have time for one more question.
Where is Avi? This is his mule he likes to be.
I'm here. I've been watching. I've been listening.
Don't know what you're talking about, obviously.
I think that selective
Dead
economy
horse.
is not a problem.
Yeah.
If
At
you
least
know
in
what
our
the stomach
conversation.
looks like and its
There you go.
There you go.
Come on, Avi.
Come on,
fibers
Avi.
look like.
Get on
I
the
think
horse.
that doing this laparoscopically is not a problem if you don't have a lot of soilage, because the vagus is even easier to identify that way. I think that you're right. There's a lot of people that can't afford the medications, Mallory. And when you talk about these textbooks that are written for middle class and upper middle class people in privileged neighborhoods with privileged healthcare systems, then they apply. But the problem is that in all the world, they study for the boards from American tech. Well, not all the world, but most of the English-speaking medical systems study for boards using American medical textbooks. And so I'm not sure that the authors of those textbooks are in tune to that. So I think you're bringing up a much bigger point here, Mallory, that goes well beyond the inner city in the nation's capital, and may have to do with, it would be very interesting to look at the book sales of major surgical textbooks and to correlate that or not correlate that with wealth and with access to care and access to better medications.
Thank you, Dr. Leventhal. This is the Rocky Mountain Trauma Society, and the organization has a distinguished history in high altitude mountaineering. Our members were involved in the introduction of Diamox for acute mountain sickness, and a former president of this organization, Tom Hornbein, who was professor of anesthesiology in Seattle, developed the high altitude mask, which he then used to traverse Everest, ascending the West Ridge the first time and coming down the normal Hillary-Tenzing route. We haven't had a whole lot of stuff like that recently, but that's about to change. Our guest speaker tonight is Mike Marolt of the eponymous Alpine family. You may have heard of his dad, who was, and the Marolt family was involved in the U.S. ski team at the very high levels as coach, running the U.S. ski team as a CEO, coaching at University of Colorado and athletic director. Yeah, that's his uncle. That's why I was stumbling. One of many reasons why I stumbled. With his brother and other local athletes and mountaineers, he's climbed a whole herd of peaks and made ski descents off most of them. And he's going to apply that history and those lessons to high altitude physiology tonight. The presentation is going to be slightly different. This is a video which lives only on the web. So I'm going to stream it from my computer. He'll be able to talk, but there's going to be a little bit of a discontinuity, and we apologize for the technical issues, but nonetheless, that's sort of where we are.
Hello, yeah, we're gonna show a film. It's called 7K, and it's a film that I've produced several films over the years on my high altitude skiing. This is one that I haven't really shown publicly, but hopefully you'll enjoy it. And then afterwards, I'll just give a few comments, just a few things that I've learned in the 30 plus years of going to high altitude, and hopefully try to bridge it back to some practical things that I've noticed living in Aspen and having friends and seeing a lot of visitors come here and suffer from the effects of altitude.
So I'd like to reiterate what a distinguished history Mike has. Now I'm going to try to get the video running.
I think skiing in the 7,000 and 8,000 meter peaks is a very demanding thing to do, and I think a lot of the satisfaction comes from the overall difficulties that are entailed not only in the specific climbing and skiing, but all of the training that leads up to it, and then the trips themselves. It's a very difficult but unbelievably satisfying thing to.
Everyone hear the video? Okay.
How's it going? Good. Really good.
Turned out to be a beautiful day with cloudy this morning, and now it's pretty nice out.
Wow. Pearl Peak, first time up here.
I mean, it's definitely a fast pace, but we just have to keep a real close monitor on everybody, make sure everybody's doing well.
As a group, we were all in our mid-40s to early 50s, and we had over 20 years of experience and over 40 expeditions to the 6, 7, and 8,000 meter peaks, and so we had the experience to understand what we were up against and what to look forward to. However, for Mike Maple, this would be the first time in his career that he had skied over 14,000 feet, and it would prove to be an interesting contrast to see how it affected people without that experience. Norjin Kanchi is a 7,000 meter peak in western Tibet that, to the best of our knowledge, had never been skied. It had perfect slopes, and from what we had heard from it from other people, it seemed to be the perfect peak to go and attempt to get another 7,000 meter peak ski. So we headed to Beijing, China, and from Beijing we flew across the country to Lhasa, Tibet, and that's where this story begins.
Supposed to be black.
Yeah. The first thing you notice when you get into China is that you have incredible jet lag. You're exactly on the other side of the world, and you're 12 hours off from your normal clock. So what you do is what all tourists do. You go out and you start seeing the sights. And fortunately, Lhasa has some unbelievable things to see.
But now we see the Buddha Palace was rebuilt by the 5th Dalai Lama.
The 5th Dalai Lama.
So we can see there are two colors, red and white colors. So white color is for the Dalai Lama. So white colors for the Tibetan politics and economy office. And the red color is used for the Dalai Lama living culture and chapel. And finally the sloop rooms.
The Potala Palace was built by the religious king Gampo in the late 7th century. And since then until today, it has been occupied by the last 13 Dalai Lamas, and they have all contributed to the construction of the building over the years. However, with the occupation of China into Tibet in the 1950s, it's estimated that 99% of all the monasteries in Tibet, along with all the stupas and shrines, were pretty much destroyed by the Chinese. However, since then, in the 1990s, the Chinese government has gone back and restored many of these, including the Potala Palace, to a state where they can be recognized and appreciated by future generations. But the Chinese still put it in your face everywhere that they're in charge. Lhasa is just a city of incredible contrast, and I think that over the years it has really been modernized, but it's still tough to take away the spirit of the Tibetans, and you see it just as prevalent.
There you go. Great.
Pretty cool though, isn't it? Isn't this cool?
Yeah.
Johang Temple sits in the middle of the center of Old Town Lhasa, the marketplace where you can get just about anything you need in Lhasa. The temple has served as a spiritual center point for the people of Lhasa, and it has also served as a convent for some of the nuns that help provide services to the monks in the places such as the Potala Palace. All the monasteries and stupas and shrines require candles, and this is a candle shop. We spent a couple of days just hanging out, checking out the sights in Lhasa, and by that time we were all ready to hit the road for the day drive that it would take us to get to base camp. We drove away from Lhasa in the opposite direction that climbers would take to get to the more popular peaks Choyo-Yu and Mount Everest, and we came across a large reservoir, and this excited us because we knew at the end of that reservoir sat our objective, Norjin Kanchi. This is base camp. We're at 15,000, approximately 15,000 what, Steve?
15.5.
15.5. And we got to set it up.
So, but is this going to be base camp, or are we going to go?
We go to an advanced base camp,
right.
around,
Right.
and that's where we start climbing.
Right.
But from here, what we'll do is we're going to spend a day here, maybe walk up to the monastery, do an acclimating hike tomorrow, and then move the next day. That's different. We were going to move tomorrow, but it's high low. It's way too
15
high.
and a half is high enough. Right
Way
now.
too high. You probably won't sleep very well.
I haven't slept very well any night yet, so why would tonight be any different?
Well, yeah, I mean, you're going to feel it. I think we're all going to feel it.
Yeah.
The next morning we got up and we did an acclimation hike right out of base camp. And when you go to these peaks that are not really well documented or anything like that, it's just amazing what you find. And it was one of the most spectacular acclimation hikes any of us had ever seen.
It's pretty nice.
It's unbelievably beautiful.
Not a whole lot of people get to see this.
Spectacular.
I mean, it's definitely hard, but it's hard going uphill. Leadership skills have been incredible.
Thanks.
Thanks for telling us where you were going. Just leaving us down there at the lake.
I figured you'd get it figured out. Don't worry, we won't make it on the mountain.
I need a little mental preparation. Know where the hell it is I'm going.
Well, on these day hikes, you just go wherever. I mean, you go by yourself. You do whatever you want. That's the beauty of it.
You go right up there if you want. Huck that little cornice there.
And how nice is this?
Do you have a temperature?
I don't, but it's pretty darn warm.
Yeah.
That's classic.
Well, today we're packing up base camp and move up to advanced base camp. We'll load up the horses with all the gear and move up to 17. Set up camp there, and tomorrow's a rest day, and then we start climbing after that. So that's the plan for today. Time to go start breaking camp.
It was still too early in the season for the yaks to be in that particular valley for grazing, so we found a rancher who had some horses, and he was the guy that helped get us up to advanced base camp. The trek from base camp to advanced base camp took the better part of the day in an effort to try and acclimate, but we finally got to a halfway point and it was beautiful, and we stopped to have a break. How we doing, boys?
It's not Kansas. Maybe
What?
Flat, maybe. May not be that steep, but it's definitely not Kansas.
Guys?
It's like a good place to camp to me. Couldn't have picked a better
Pretty
day.
cool place, huh?
Couldn't have picked a better day to be walking up these alpine meadows. This is beautiful. Incredible. Just incredible. Quite possibly the most beautiful base camp I've ever been. This is beautiful. What do you think? Yes.
Very nice. Nice place.
How do you feel?
Yeah.
Feel good?
Good, yeah. And you?
I feel good.
Okay.
Unmentionable. Unmentionable. My blood sat would be about 5 points higher if I didn't sleep with Maple last night. The worst egg farts on the planet.
I don't know.
One after another after another.
He woke me up twice out of a dead sleep. It was so
Was it the noise or the smell?
The smell.
I had a rough night. A little too much courage.
Maple, what's your excuse?
I slept great. Everything was good.
Farts didn't bother you.
In fact, they probably felt good.
Felt good, yeah, exactly right.
Cornflakes down the
The lungs don't feel so good.
Have another cigarette.
There we go.
John made it through the night, but he's not going to make it through
I had
breakfast.
to choke on my cornflakes.
Joe, did you have any problems?
I sleep alone. I only have to worry about myself. No,
So I think the
just filled up the pee bottle, that was it.
sea level to 16,000 feet finally caught up to me.
Yeah.
It was not a good night.
We better be careful.
Massive headache. Besides the farts. Not what I was looking for. But I expect to recover today. Hopefully. I did an hour walk down this morning. Felt a lot better, even though it was only 600 or 700 feet. The access road. I might do that again today.
It makes a difference just going down there a little bit.
Well, it's waking up, you breathe, too.
What's that?
I just got You're waking up, you breathe. You know, when you fall asleep at night, your sat drops and you breathe.
Ham's condition just never improved, and as a matter of fact, he had to spend his last night there on oxygen. So it was pretty critical, and we made a decision to get him out. So Steve and John escorted him back to base camp, and then we found him a ride back to Lhasa.
We're just gonna make a carry up, hopefully 3,000 feet or so.
I'm doing okay. This is going to be a really tough day for me, I know. But just real slow and steady. And I'll be looking forward to the fact that coming down is I won't have any weight on my back. So, anyway, it's a beautiful day so far.
I'm making a carry of all the heavy stuff, the hardware, skis and harnesses, and pickets, ropes, tents and stuff are all going up today. Hopefully get acclimated. Got a load going on here. Get that stuff up the mountain, get ourselves acclimated. Right now. They have it.
So we've come up about 1,500 feet on this talus, and I think next time we'll cross over and head up the snowfield to the right. But there's John Gibbons. We've been out for a couple hours. We are at 19,050 feet. How you feel?
I feel like $10,000. That feels good.
Exactly 2 hours and we're at 19,000, just over.
I don't think we're at 19.
Yeah, we are.
We had 18.8 on my barometer. Let me check the your barometer, the GPS.
How you doing, homeboy?
Woo. That was some work. Oh shit! All right. This thing turned off. Damn it! Is that low battery? Shit. Low battery.
How you feeling?
Feeling pretty good. Legs are tired. My legs don't. I thought they'd be exhausted today, but they're not. Feel good. This will be slam dunk. Up
Give
over
Joe.
the other side.
Yo.
How you doing?
Bad?
Bad?
I said not bad. There's two choices. Bad, not bad. Or none of the above. I'm doing not bad.
The son of a crack ass.
At almost 20,000 somewhere. Head up to Camp 1 on the first day. Hauling some big loads. Summit in the background.
after a brutal day, we finally had our high camp established, and it really felt good. I think that in the process of climbing and acclimating, it takes a lot of steps to get to the top of these peaks, and getting past these initial hurdles is always a great source of satisfaction.
Okay, so here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna go touch it today. Screw a picket. I don't think we'll need them, but we got them. We got a rope. We're gonna go down this dirt ridge, gonna get on the snow, and we're gonna find a way up over the top of that snow dome right there. However, which way we can.
The big objective right out of our high camp was a huge ramp at about 40 to 45 degrees, and we didn't know if it was ice. It had definitely had a lot of slots on it, and so we wanted to go touch it and also haul some hardware up to the top of it for the ultimate summit push. So it was an exciting day.
20,300 feet reconnaissance climb. Camp is down there at the end of the lake. High camp's over there, and this is the first kind of obstacle to get up this. Maple, you got the high altitude personal best so far, about 21,000?
Yeah.
How you feel?
Every step. But yeah, so the big discovery of the day is there's no such thing as a conversational pace, and trying to eat and walk at the same time is also impossible.
Yeah, there is. I just didn't want to talk to you. I didn't want to talk to you.
How you doing, Gib?
Actually, I need to talk to him. This guy he was my hero this morning. Brewing up while I felt like crap. And here I am.
Here we are.
We ended up getting to the top of the snow dome at 21,000 feet with no problems. We cached a couple of ropes and some hardware, then we headed back down to high camp. And it was an exciting time because we had skis waiting for us, and we knew we were going all the way back down to base camp, and that we were going to get our first skiing of the trip, so it was great.
$19,600 feet, going for a ski run, all right! Boy. Okay, let those atomic descenders descend. Go. Tough snow. Go ahead, Johnny. Let the climbers ski.
Hamilton gave him so much shit about his double pole plant that I can see he's working on it.
Rough conditions. Some really rough snow up here.
Maple coined the phrase Tibetan corduroy, and that fit this type of snow just perfectly. It was unbelievably difficult to ski. But when you're skiing in the Himalaya, I mean, it's hard to put it into words, but it is so much fun, and it is just so absolutely satisfying that you just can't even imagine it. And we skied down that 2,000 or 3,000 feet back to advanced base camp, and we spent the next 2 days just with smiles on our faces. It doesn't matter how hard you work or how difficult the trip is. Once you click into your skis and you make turns in the Himalaya, it makes everything right, and it's just that simple. And it was just incredibly fun. Just a great way to end a really great push up the mountain and set our minds straight to get ready to go for the summit.
Across the lake. shade right in there. You can see our ski tracks in there. Right up the ridge. And right at the top there, you can just see the tents of Camp 1. And we follow the ridge. And inset from the gray peak there, you can see then there's a bench. And right up the rightmost line to the top of the dome. And up the slopes to the summit. The boys are going up on an acclimation hike. How's the trip been going so far? We'll start with Gib Joe.
Gib Joe. Oh, that's me. Trip's going good. Today we're on the last day before our summit push. I think it's probably a good idea. It's a little windy up there today, but went for just a great little hike here. See if our camp's still in, and saw a couple, I don't know if they're blue sheep or what kind of sheep, but they don't let you get too close. Hoping to see the snow leopard chasing them, but didn't see that either, but had fun looking around. And
what about you, Maple?
Back to you, Mike.
Everything's good. Listening to the Marolt stories has been an exercise in endurance, and I think has been an important part of the acclimatization process. But some of them have been funny. So everything's good.
Any you guys homesick at all?
Oh, we're out here on an adventure. You know, it's I miss my bride's cooking, but Gumbo's doing a good job. But I'll be happy to have a glass of wine and a pasta dinner with my bride. That's for sure.
That's you, Gib Joe. You ever
Yeah,
get
that wine
homesick?
sounds good.
Do you ever get homesick on these?
Of course I do, but you just kind of push through. Today's a great day. I'm really enjoying this. So we got some fun climbing ahead of us, and hopefully we'll breathing hard that you guys can't tell any stories.
We hung out at Advanced Base Camp for a couple more days. We were well rested, well hydrated. We'd been eating some really good food, and summit fever finally kind of caught on, and we were ready to head for the summit. So we would hike back up to Camp 1 and begin our push. Steve is in this single-person Nemo, and we have this new three-person Nemo that is just outrageous. Let's go see what's going on. What's going on, guys?
Close the door, it's cold.
You guys.
Maple's crabby. Complaining.
What's he complaining about?
This and that.
Steve's been pretty well behaved today.
Did you guys ever figure out how to properly value real estate?
Come on.
I don't know, how much you give me for this piece right here?
All right, everybody feels good? No headaches?
I need to drink more.
All right.
Mapes hasn't peed since he left.
I got scotch.
Gib Joe, how you doing?
A little cloudy, a little foggy in the mind. Feel like I can fly.
All right.
Most doctors do.
All right, guys. Good night. Zip me out.
Gib Joe. No, you got it.
There's the peak. It is cold out. I gotta get back in my tent.
Right now we're cooking dinner. Got our stove going here in the tent, despite what it says about for outside use only. We're gonna keep it in the tent. It's pretty cozy in here right now. Got a great campsite. Someone already flattened out some areas for us, so it was easy to set up. Right now we're drinking some beef bouillon. Pretty tasty. I'm feeling good. Got a beautiful morning to go out and start climbing. Full moon, pretty warm temperature.
Yeah.
Not a lot of wind. There are some lenticulars over the top of the peaks, but they seem to be blowing off, so I'm hoping this is kind of the same weather pattern we've been in for the last few days, which has been really good. Feeling good, overslept, but we'll make up for it.
We're at 19.
At least you're sleeping. I wasn't getting any sleeping done last night in that wind. It was howling all night long. No, that wind wasn't howling all day. But I did manage to get some sleep. So.
Okay, head on out.
Let's go. It's a little cool right now without my partner. I'm thinking that'll change the moment I start moving up the hill.
How you doing?
Good.
We reached the top of the snow dome just as the sun started to top out on the peaks, and it was incredibly cold.
Not the greatest of days, but how you guys doing?
Okay. Actually, glad. Nice day.
Just throwing a couple of wands right on this slot.
Unlike the more popular peaks in the Himalaya, Norjan Kanchi had no visitors for a long time, definitely nobody that season. And so we had to find our own route, and it was just incredibly slotted the whole way. I mean, it was back and forth across the face, and you'd have to mark your route, kind of the breadcrumb theory, to make sure that you could find your way off, but also to mark the crevasses so that when you were skiing down, you wouldn't fall into them unexpectedly. So it took a lot of time, and it was very demanding, but it was part of the adventure.
What's the altitude here, Steve?
22.4.
Taking a rest. How long have we been out?
6 hours.
We're 22,829. Trying to get up to 7,000 meters. That's the summit pyramid. Had a little weather move in. We're just giving it our best. Gib Joe, how you doing?
Hurting.
By this time, we'd been climbing for almost 8 hours, and it was cold, and the weather had started to set in, and yet we just had to keep plodding along. The upper slope of Norjan Kanchi had these crevasses that went from one side of the face to the other, and trying to get across them entailed a lot of back and forth. It was just absolutely brutal at that altitude, just exhausting. We had been climbing all day, and the weather was nasty, and we were just hammered. And I remember we got up to the summit plateau just at about 23,000 feet, and I looked over the edge, and I saw the lake that we had come across on our acclimation climb out of base camp, and it was almost 10,000 feet below us, and it was just incredible.
Trying to find a route through up here. It's steep with good snow and wind.
Well, a little late in the day. Weather comes in and out. A little slabby. Not real confident with conditions.
Yeah, I'm bummed. But a little spooked on the slabby snow, and I just don't want to take those chances anymore. So I decided to pull the plug.
And this is easily steep.
What's that?
Angle-wise, this is steep.
Maple, how you doing?
How am I doing? I'm good, but that's definitely the hardest thing I've ever done. Times
That was a hard
10.
day.
I mean, it's just unbelievable how hard that is.
Well, I think normally when you just have a trail, somebody that's been there before you, no route finding, it takes a lot of the nervous energy away, and it's a lot easier. But this is a long route, so.
Well, to me it felt like doing bench jumps to exhaustion, and then at random You had to go again.
How you doing, Steve?
Watching that snake roll away from you.
Steve?
What?
How are you?
Good. Disappointed, but good.
The GPS gave us a final reading of 7,100 meters, which was just a few hundred feet shy of the summit. But the summit pyramid had really wind-loaded slopes with a crust on it, and it was kind of an eerie place. And it was late in the day with storms moving in, and it was time to go home.
Putting your skis on it. Over 23,000 feet on a steep slope. Definitely not an easy thing to do. Build a little platform and just be extremely careful. This is your second 7,000 meter ski? Go for it.
Oh God.
No puking.
Oh God.
After 9 hours of climbing at 23,000 feet.
So there you are, you're after 9 hours of climbing to a new altitude, so you're not acclimated. You're extremely exhausted, and you click into those skis, and it just takes everything in your power to get down it. And everything seems to just go into slow motion, and you just let gravity take over, and it is just the ultimate rush.
Day? Oh, that's an understatement. Mike?
Was that a hard day? Yeah, this is my hardest day ever by a factor of about 4. I'm spent.
Steve?
Super hard day.
As we pulled off the mountain, I began to reflect on what Dr. Houston came up with back in the 30s in his studies. And you know, when you're climbing at these altitudes, it really is an exercise in survival. And by that I mean that when you're there, you're pushing yourself to the limit. You're on the edge, and you know, keeping your wits about you and staying alive is a huge part of the satisfaction that you get from suffering like that. You throw in the fact that you're there with your best friends and you're all working together as a team, and that becomes a very special thing. You're never going to be able to compete with a mountain. It's really a matter of competing with yourself. And when you do that and you understand that, you come away from these trips as better people. You have tighter friendships, and it's a rewarding experience, a victory in and of itself.
Well, thank you very much for a truly remarkable mountain video. I was gonna reiterate about Dr. Hornbeam, but your film conveniently pointed out and referenced Dr. Houston, who with Dr. O'Dane helped found this organization. You must have some thoughts about physiology now.
Yeah, I think that Dr. Houston was a friend that early on in my career, he actually, he didn't live in Aspen when I was a young man, but he did spend some time here. And over the years, I had called him often, and really he wrote a book called Going Higher, which was based on his altitude studies in the 70s and again in the 80s. And he became kind of the benchmark for high altitude, and is really, in the climbing world anyways, considered the guru. And so he was a guy that we bounced a lot of questions off of often. And I think one of the interesting things, first and foremost, is that in today's pop culture mountaineering, the death zone, we often hear about that, and people think that that's 8,000 meters. And based on his studies, he's actually the guy that coined that phrase, the death zone. And it really starts at 23,000 feet. And, you know, I think relating back to the film, there was an example there with Hamilton that I think highlights some very practical aspects to acclimation. And Hamilton was a writer that wanted to join us on the trip. He was writing a book on high altitude ski mountaineering. He was not a high altitude ski mountaineer. And I think it was interesting for us, and we were a little bit nervous. And so we were nervous from the standpoint of exactly what forced him to go home. And we tried to get him to come to Aspen, and he did for about 4 days the week before we took off. And when you contrast that with all the rest of the guys, we live in Aspen. And so we had been climbing all winter. We'd been getting to 14,000 feet, roughly 4,000 meters, at least 1 day a week for the couple of months before that. And we thought that, well, if Hamilton can come to Aspen at 8,000 feet and go climb the Highlands Bowl a few times, which we did, we thought, well, hopefully that'll help him acclimate coming from altitude. We were still a little bit skeptical, and that was compounded by the fact that there wasn't a lot of beta on this mountain, and we thought that we would be coming in at about 14,000 feet. And I think that had we been able to come in at 14,000 feet, Hamilton would have had a much better chance. But regardless, just a little bit about my career. I started doing this when I was 12 years old, and then our forte is the 5,000, so roughly 17,000 foot peaks up through the 8,000 meter peaks, which is 26,000 feet. And we really got into that when we were in our early 20s. We started heading to South America and then eventually to Asia. And we've concentrated on expeditions to roughly 60 of those peaks over the years. So we had a huge advantage. But in the process, reading books like Going Higher and then just experimenting in the field, when you go to Asia or you go to the Andes, typically your base camp's going to be anywhere from 14,000 feet in the Andes to 17,000 feet in the Himalaya. And then you're going to have an advanced base camp, maybe 1,000 to 2,000 feet higher than that. Well, that distance between base camp and advanced base camp is your window of safety. And over the years, we have been able to figure out that we cannot go higher than the next camp until we are fully acclimated to base camp. And it takes us 8 days to fully acclimate, so that if we do get up to higher elevations and we start working the peak and someone does get sick, we've got a 2,000 foot buffer. And how do we know that we're acclimated? Well, you can feel it, but from a technical point of view, we know that we can't go higher on a mountain until our sat rates are at least 89 and higher. And our resting pulse rates are within 10% of our base when we're at home. And so through the process of going to altitude a lot on a lot of those trips, those are that's kind of the metrics that we work in and that we look for. So we take pulse ox readings and take our pulse just constantly, just monitoring each other. But it's interesting, and I think that, you know, from a medical perspective, Gibjo, who was actually in this film, Dr. Gibbons, is actually runs the clinic out here at Snowmass, and he's got a high interest in high altitude medicine, and he's also done a lot of climbs with us and a lot of other climbs on his own, and he really knows the ropes around that. But it's interesting because they're relating the practical aspect of living at a place like Aspen at 8,000 feet. When friends come to town and when visitors come here, you do see a lot of, not necessarily hape and haste, but you do see a lot of acute mountain sickness. And I think that one of the factors that not a lot of the medical people are aware of is really surrounds the notion of what impacts altitude. Altitude is not, it's not the same in Aspen, it's not the same on the top of Mount Everest. And the primary factor that increases it or decreases it relating to the effective altitude of where you are really is temperature. And we figured that out over the years on a couple of trips. One, we thought we were going to end up starting the trip on the Punta Atacama Desert at 14,000 feet. And when we got to the base camp, it was actually 15,500 feet, but it was 15 below zero. And so we were not too concerned. We trained to 14,000 feet all the time. But over the course of the first couple of days, half of our team started to get acute mountain sickness. And by the third day, 3 of them had developed pulmonary edema. And so we had to drive them back down. They went down for a week and they fully recovered and came back up, and we were able to summit the peak, which was no small peak at 22,000 feet. But it made me wonder, it's like, with as much climbing experience and altitude experience that we have, why did those guys get sick? Then in 2016, we started venturing into the Himalaya in the winter. And the temperature swings in the winter, typically at, say, Everest Base Camp, it could be 20 to 40 degrees at base camp. In the winter, it's generally minus 20 to minus 40. And so we flew into this peak called Himlung. And here again, we thought we were going to be basing at about 14,000 feet, and it was 15,500 feet, and it was 40 below zero. So we got out of the helicopter, because in the winter you have to helicopter to base camps because of the snow. We're moving around, everybody's excited, everybody's feeling great. We got the camp set up and we went in to have a cup of coffee, and everybody at the same time, just the tent just started spinning. And we looked at our altimeters, and it was 15,500 feet, and we just couldn't figure it out. And there was no way to retreat. So it was really one of the scariest moments in our career. And we just came to the conclusion that it was because the cold had increased the effective altitude by about 2,000 feet. Jim Guile, who climbs with us, is a math major, and he's a math geek. He brings problem-solving books on the expeditions, and he took all of the information, and he knows how to calculate effective altitude. And if you go to a website that we have called 8kpeak.com and look in the blog, you can see his report. But it's interesting because the difference in altitude in the spring on, say, Mount Everest versus the winter is over 3,000 feet. The effective altitude increases 3,000 feet because the temperature goes from zero up at the higher altitudes down to minus 60. Mount Everest at 29,000 feet, effective altitude in the normal climbing season on a lot of days falls below 8,000 meters. Other interesting facts are a lot of climbers realize that peaks like Denali, Mount McKinley in Alaska, appear to climb a little bit higher. And a lot of people think that's because the poles are flat and that the gravitational pull is different and it impacts the atmosphere. That has a very slight impact on the effective altitude. The main reason is that Denali is so far north that it's just cold. And so the effective altitude of Denali in the normal climbing season turns a 20,000 foot peak into, roughly a 21 or 22,000 foot peak. And so relating that to Aspen, it's interesting. I'm a CPA by trade, and one of my clients is a big lodge, and it's a high-end lodge, and they provide supplemental oxygen for their guests if they're experiencing acute mountain sickness. And a couple of years ago, they ran out, and I said, well, did you take into consideration the effective altitude? And they didn't know what I was talking about. And I said, yeah, I mean, it was a cold snap where we had a week period where it was about 20 below zero. And just looking at the calculations that Jim did, the effective altitude in Aspen went from 8,000 to about 10,000 feet. And that's why a lot of those people coming to the resort were experiencing acute mountain sickness. So, I'm not a doctor, and a lot of it is based on just my experience, but those are some of the thoughts that I had coming into this presentation. And then just one more kind of interesting thing that I want to just throw out there to the medical community is this whole notion of why some people do better at altitude. When you look at my identical twin brother and I, we can go to altitude and we don't climb with Sherpa or oxygen, and we never use altitude drugs or anything. And, I've been to over 28,000 feet without oxygen, and outside of the fact that my feet started to freeze, I felt relatively normal. And when I looked around me, the vast majority of people were on oxygen, and they were not doing so well. And so I really started to wonder about that. And then about 20 years ago, my father actually died from hereditary heart disease at a relatively young age, but he was a super strong endurance type of athlete. He was an Olympic skier, and then he was just super strong. And I always wondered why he was so strong, because he didn't train, and he wasn't in great shape, but he really had an ability to go hard. And that translated into my twin brother and my older brother and even my sister. So I thought, well, I need to go get my heart checked. And so I went up to the hospital here in Aspen with my doctor, and they put me in the machines where they were x-raying my heart and my lungs and my veins, and everything was completely clean. But under my doctor's voice, not talking to me, he said, "Oh my God, he's got an enlarged heart." And I said, "What?" And then he said, "Oh, wait a minute." He goes, "My God, you've got enlarged lungs." And then he said, "And your veins are just massive." And there was no explanation for that. I was gifted genetically with a little bit bigger heart than normal, a little bit bigger lungs than normal, and veins that were half again as big as a normal person. So my veins were really huge. So I had this big motor that could pump a lot of blood. Subsequently, I on the stress test tested super high with off the charts VO2. And I mean, I had never tested any of that kind of stuff. So the doctor didn't have an explanation for it outside of genetics. And so I started to do my own study, and I came across a doctor from South America who had studied this, and he had spent time in Nepal studying the Sherpa. And then he studied some of the tribes in the Peruvian Andes. And what he came to a conclusion that after testing numerous people in both of these areas, that they had the same genetic disposition that I had. Their lungs were a little bit bigger, their hearts were a little bit bigger, but their veins were massive. And especially for the guys that he tested in Peru. And I mean, these were generational families that had lived at 16,000 feet for, you know, hundreds of years. The Sherpa were not quite as exaggerated as the Peruvians, but they had lived for multiple generations at 14 and 15,000 feet. And he came to the conclusion, and what he told me is that genetically speaking, the thing that adapts quickest through evolution in our biology is ability to adapt to altitude. And he said, based on looking at the families that he looked at, it was a 5-generation thing. And I'm 4th generation at 8,000 feet in Aspen. And he said that there's no doubt in his mind that that's why my brothers and my sister and my father had this genetic ability to adapt to altitude. So I'm not a doctor, as I said, but I thought that that was pretty interesting. And there's no doubt that I climb high altitude without Sherpa and without oxygen and without drugs, just simply because I don't need them. So anyways, I'll open up the floor to discussion. And if anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to try and answer them.
So since we can't go back and change our family tree, what do you recommend for the mortals, aside from being very careful about acclimating and being in shape?
Well, the thing that I've noticed, and it was confirmed by Dr. Houston, is that the altitude is a pyramid. It doesn't matter if you're a world-class athlete. In fact, John Callahan, who was in the film, was an Olympic cross-country skier. And ironically, the higher he got, his blood sat when he was normal was so high that he had to have permission from his doctor in order to race. And he was an Olympic skier. And he had to get a sign off because his crit levels were so high. Well, when he got to 23,000 feet and we spent a month at 23,000 feet, his blood got so thick that he couldn't go down. He couldn't pump the blood that he needed. And on the airplane, he started to stroke out a little bit. But the thing that I know from my experience, because Jim, who climbs with us, doesn't have this genetic disposition, the more you go to altitude, the better you get at it. And what do I mean by that? I don't know the physiology, but what I've been told and what Dr. Houston believed is that when you go to altitude a lot successfully, following the rules, knowing that at a certain altitude, it doesn't matter if you're a world-class athlete or a couch potato, the human anatomy can only work so well at a certain altitude. In other words, there's a ceiling the higher you get. So you have to be successful. You have to understand that it takes 8 days to acclimate before you can go higher. You have to follow the hard, fast rules that in mountaineering are pretty standard. And if you follow those and you're successful and you don't push the limits, what Dr. Houston believed was that the cells retain some kind of memory so that when you go back, the body doesn't overreact, because HACE and HAPE are really just the body's ability they're overreacting to force you to go down. And so if you're successful at that a lot, it really helps. And I know that in my career, for example, Norjin Konsang was a 2.5-week trip. When I first started going to the Himalaya, there's no possible way that I could have accomplished that climb in under 5 weeks.
Now, you're not a doctor, but I am. And so for the members who are on the call, the clear implication of this is that the only safe way to participate in this meeting on an ongoing basis is that you actually have to come out here and be physically here next year. This is an urgent public health problem, and we're delighted that Mike is highlighting this.
There's no doubt about that. You know, Dr. Liebenthal, Michael, found me dying in the Pocolati Inn when I first came to Aspen. And he walked in my room.
Can you guys hear
He says
Dr.
to me,
Dr.
he looks
Woods?
at me, he said, and I look at his face and I get scared. He says, Mal, you look like shit. And he starts to opening up the windows and everything.
Yeah.
He says, I got to get you some dive box. You dive.
Yeah.
And I had been to Afghanistan. I had been to Comayagua and in Honduras. I had been in some elevations, but when I got here the first time, it was, I wasn't a happy camper. And then, this time is much better. So it must be something.
It is the first time I went on an 8,000 meter peak in '97. It was really fun and exciting and I did well, but it was really hard. And altitude is always a difficult thing. But there's some kind of physiological memory in the cells when you do it successfully. And on the flip side of that, I've known climbers that were one climber that was probably the most experienced climber I've ever met, who had been to 8,000 meters 20 times, and he climbed all the high peaks in Alaska. And he did it successfully over a period of about 40 years. And on one climb in Alaska, it was only a 14,000 foot peak. And he came from sea level and he thought, well, I can just go do 14,000 feet. He got to the top of 14,000 feet and he almost died and had to be evacuated off the peak. And he could not go to altitude after that to save his life. And so we've always been extremely respectful of altitude and really played by the rules. And it's funny, you go on these trips, and especially in a lot of the commercial trips, you get a lot of posturing and you get a lot of competition, and you get young people that are just running up the peak. And we've always gone to those peaks with really good food for the first half of the peak, going really slow, really slow. And then once we're acclimated, we're passing everybody when we're up high on the peak. And it's discipline, and it's just having had really great mentors that really taught us the ropes, like Dr. Houston and some of his contemporaries that really just figured it out the hard way and helped us to avoid some of the pitfalls of going to altitude. But it's a big problem. A lot of people come to Aspen to go skiing and they get acute mountain sickness. The other obvious golden rules are you have to hydrate. You almost can't drink too much fluids. Alcohol, we used to take alcohol on our trips, and at altitude, it doesn't have the same effect. It just makes you feel sick and it dehydrates you. Other things that we have figured out, that coffee with caffeine is a stimulant. And if you do have kind of a tinge of a headache and you drink some caffeine, it increases your circulation and helps alleviate that pain. Nicotine, none of us smoke, but we were all baseball players. So we used to chew a little bit of, not tobacco, but the nicotine patches. But the problem that you have with that is that if you do it in really small doses, it works great. But if you cross the line, your heart is working so hard already when you're at those altitudes that you can literally, if you drink too much coffee one day, you can't climb at all that day because you don't have the energy to do it. So we kind of stay away from that as well. Plus it constricts your blood flow in your fingers and your toes and your cheeks, and it subjects you to frostbite.
So we have a bunch of plastic surgeons in this organization. You start talking about the nitrogen containing compounds, and fortunately, Dr. Caterson his head hasn't exploded yet because of your dose response comments at the end. And I am probably the foremost exponent in this organization of moving slowly uphill these days, thanks to the gentle efforts of my physicians who've made it so I don't have a choice. Do we have some other questions? This is kind of a remarkable opportunity.
I think that
Dr. Leventhal.
I think that even the smallest illness, even the smallest little bit of flu or something, can be a real cog in your wheels when you're climbing altitude or when you're going to a higher place. And so you really have to watch out for that as well.
I missed the first part.
I'm saying even the smallest illness, even, just like a very mild flu or something like that, that at Denver wouldn't bother you at all. If you're up at Aspen, it may actually bother you. Or if you're going from Aspen 2,000-3,000 feet higher, it may really get you.
There's most definitely, if you have any kind of a cold, and oftentimes you do up there just because there's a lot of bugs that are foreign to us in America when you go there. Along those lines, in almost every single case of pulmonary edema that I've ever seen, it was preluded by some kind of stomach bug. And I don't know what the correlation is there, but it's a stomach bug and then the edema. And so what we do is we're very careful. We always wash our hands. We always look in the kitchen. Our kitchen staff always has hand sanitizer. We make them use soap to prevent that. And then we do something that a lot of doctors probably would cringe at, but we take antibiotics at the slightest sign of gut irritations just to avoid it, because for some reason, every single time I've been in those mountains with somebody that's gotten some kind of acute not beyond acute mountain sickness, but HACE or HAPE, it's always been after or during a bad stomach, gastrointestinal type stuff.
We have time for one more question. Actually, we don't. We're a half hour late, but we've had some spectacular talks. Well, I suppose, given the incidence of Giardia here, we might give you a pass on the antibiotics if it's flagyl. And it works on a lot of the things you might be likely to find at a base camp in those parts of the world. I did not know about the connection with Dr. Houston. We will be hearing more about his contributions to this organization and his book when Dr. Perry, for those of you who are new to the group, our longtime leader, who's only 99 years old, will be talking tomorrow. That's pretty much it. Mike has a book. Some of our distinguished guest lecturers will be getting copies of the book, and everybody needs to go out and read it. And the argument about cold weather and altitude is quite interesting. And if you think of it in a fluid dynamics standpoint, some of the argument, if I understand it correctly, essentially is saying as cold air gets density, if you think of the air above a mountain as a big column, it essentially all sinks down. And there's not enough flowing in from everywhere else. And so while it's not intuitively obvious, that's sort of the nature of the argument. And these guys have spent enough time at elevation to know. So thank you all very much. We're starting again in 12 short hours. We have, as Ed Sullivan would say, a really big shoot tomorrow. And that's pretty much it. Thank you all for your flexibility regarding the schedule today. We had some unavoidable changes, and we still have a lot more fun stuff to do. Thanks again and good night.